I can't hear anything.
Didn't say anything useful anyway.
Now I can hear.
Now you can hear. I think we're ready.
Yeah, before we were talking about you, now we're talking with you. So.
Recording in progress.
So good evening, everyone. This is I think, a regularly scheduled meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee. What a radical idea. And I'm Lyle Baker, the chair, and I'm joined in the committee room by the vice chair, Councilor Oliver from Ward 1, by Councilor Albright from Ward 2, Councilor Getz from Ward 5. On screen, joining us also from the committee, Councilor Krentzman from Ward 4, Councilor Wright from Ward 3, and I think that's it with the committee. We're also going to be joined by a non-committee member, Councilor Lucas. And have I got anybody else on the council? I haven't.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me.
Thank you.
Councilor Farrell in the room, but not a member of the committee. Won't you come join us at the table because there's room and
You have room, that's great.
So we have the primary item on the agenda tonight is going to be the question of how to deal with inclusionary zoning. And before we start, I want to just say a little bit about the process that anticipates. We also have tonight another item about training with inclusionary zoning, and then a question about parking and the reappointment of a member of the Historical Commission. My intention is to devote most of the evening to being as clear as we can in committee on what we would like to recommend to our colleagues to put out for public hearing on this item. We've heard this matter before. This is the second round, but more detailed now to try and move beyond concept to specific choices. What I've asked the planning director to do, and Mr. Heath, you can join us at the table if you would like, is to be our tour guide, in effect, and help us walk through the various items in the memo. There's a comprehensive memo that was in our packet, but for members of the public who may not have seen that document, I want to just give a little bit of background on this, and my colleagues who have been through this before, like Councilor Albright, can correct me if I make a mistake. But the basic premise behind the inclusionary zoning ordinance is that we have a process in Newton whereby people can apply for housing opportunity greater than they would be available as of right. But it is something that also we would like to have produce a degree of affordable housing opportunity at the same time. This is not as intense a process as goes through with the Zoning Board of Appeals in a 40B. 40B, you have to have 25% of your units affordable to be able to qualify for a comprehensive permit. This ordinance is, I think, probably about the fourth iteration of work in the City Council to try and find the right balance between opportunity on the part of the developer, but also opportunity for the city in terms of affordable housing that is a byproduct of that development that goes forward. What we've done is, on several occasions in the past, made changes where we now have our consultants here. We have our planning director and the planning staff to guide us. We have representatives from the Newton Housing Partnership we're grateful for, who have spent a lot of time thinking about this, whose goal is affordable housing. Our challenge as we go through this is to find the right balance that will encourage people to come through the gate and do this, take this opportunity for a special permit, then provide us some affordable housing in the process, but not make the gate so difficult that they don't go through, but also make sure that we get opportunity that's appropriate from the benefit we're giving the developer. That's the balance we're trying to strike, but it's articulated in a lot of detail in the draft changes to the ordinance. Mr. Heath, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well. We're ready to dive in. You are.
Okay. Okay. Any questions from the committee? We've also been joined by Councilor Kalis, the Vice President from Ward 8. So glad to have you.
And Councilor Danberg and Malik here also.
Councilor Danberg is here online. Welcome. Okay. Now, the process that I talked about with the director is that to go through the planning department's memo is kind of the guidepost of trying to figure out where we are, pause at each section, but also talk about those sections where we might have a consensus or a preliminary judgment on the behalf of the committee, but be sensitive to those sections which essentially are interlocked. In other words, one decision here affects a decision somewhere else, so that when we get through, we're aware of where this is not entirely a serial process where we can just go from start to finish and have a sense that that's automatically going to change, bring us to a conclusion. But the objective I hope we can reach is to end this evening's discussion with as much clarity as we can, so that we can advertise something for a public hearing in the fall, and then be clear about it. So because it's going to be up to us as members of the committee to explain this rather complicated topic to our colleagues who are not on the committee and depend on us to try and figure it out for them, or at least set it up for their decision. Any comments from any members of the committee or before we begin?
I have a question.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
council. Yeah.
Counselor Wright.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm almost home, so I'm driving, so I couldn't raise my hand.
I would rather you drive safely than raise your hand.
My question is, and you said each section are in the memos, the lettered it, the different sections, or maybe they numbered it. Are we going to stop at each one for discussion? Because that's kind of how I did my notes. And then are we going to possibly do a straw vote, kind of get an idea where people stand on each of those items? Or are you going to be grouping them? And if you're going to group them, are you going to go in order?
No, I want to go through each item if we can to try and pause for the committee to reflect on it. Whether we need a vote or whether we have some sense of consensus, we'll just have to see. But I think it's too difficult to go through and cluster everything. The choice of clustering itself is a judgment call, and I think might get us lost. And certainly I don't want to just go all the way through and then try and figure it out at the end. Councilor Getz?
The only question I have is anybody here from RKG?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, great.
Both of
Oh,
them.
no, super. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't-
Available to answer questions.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
but they are not expecting to make a presentation
No, there
tonight.
was a slide
right.
deck though. Sorry, I didn't know if we were gonna go through. that.
Okay. Now, Mr. Director, do you want to start us off?
Happy to. So as I do that, Shaylin can pull up the memo, which I think was organized in a good fashion. So that we can kind of walk through what we have been talking about. We also have RKG online, who have been before this group and the Housing Partnership several times. And we think we're at a point tonight where we can walk through the main pieces of the ordinance and share with you three opinions here, where we have a lot of consensus on most of the items, but not all. From RKG, who's online, the partnership that provided their recommendation in a memo, and the planning team. So Laura Kreitz, who's here, the Director of Housing and Community Development, and Shaylin Davis Iannaco, who's our Housing Program Manager. And she wades in the IZ ordinance all the time, so is a good person to walk through the main sections. So we'll have Shaylin do it, and Shaylin, I think you heard the discussion about stopping at each one and then taking questions and comments at that point, then we'll proceed to the next one. So we're
Absolutely.
happy to speak to Shaylin, and if you can be as loud as possible, Shaylin.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Great, okay. So I think between Barney and Counselor Baker, we kind of summarized this first page and a half or so of the memo, which just says we are required by the ordinance to review our IZ ordinance, review and recalibrate our IZ ordinance every 5 years. Last time this was done was August 2019. So last summer, we really kicked this off. RKG was looking at 5 things as part of their scope of work and compiled their recommendations into 2 tables, which you received in your packet. I'm kind of summarizing all of these recommendations here as 11 pieces. So just jumping into the first one, The first recommendation was the elimination of the two-tier system of affordability from the current inclusionary zoning ordinance. Now, practically speaking, what this means is we have a tier 1, which is affordable at or between 50% of the area median income and 80% of the area median income, with a requirement to average out at 65% of the area median income. So that's what tier 1 is. There's a second tier as well, which in the ordinance is described as between 80% of AMI to 110% of the area median income. Sorry, and I should say AMI is area median income as well. Practically speaking, developers are just choosing 110% of AMI, and that is generally speaking fine. So that is for rental projects and ownership projects. RKG has recommended eliminating tier 2 across the board, which you've heard from RKG in the past. For rental units, they can be particularly hard to fill, and that is not something that is unique to Newton. It's kind of what is typical in this area. And we can get more deeply affordable units if we shift that percentage of affordability. So scrolling on through, essentially RKG has, of course, recommended removing tier 2 throughout the ordinance. So I've highlighted in each section where tier 2 is mentioned for your review. So summarizing the recommendations at the bottom, RKG again has recommended removing tier 2 for all projects and simplifying the definition of an inclusionary unit to mean any deed restricted housing unit priced to be affordable to households with annual gross incomes at or below 80% of the area median income. Now, the partnership and the planning department, I think, agree with removing tier 2 for rental housing projects because they are more difficult to fill. However, we think retaining the two-tier system for condos or ownership projects does make sense because it allows for middle income starting families essentially to move into condos in Newton. And I think my understanding, and Kyle or Jason from RKG, please feel free to jump in, is that that is okay with RKG as well. That makes sense to them, and it's not going to hurt the ordinance to keep the two-tiered system for home ownership units.
So
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, before you start, just a minute, Councilor Wright's got her hand up. Councilor Wright, do you mind if we finish clarifying the presentation, and I'll be glad to recognize you and the other members of the committee. Okay, excuse me, go ahead. Please identify yourself again every time you speak, just because the public doesn't know who you are. We know who you are, but we're trying to create a record that other people can look at it and understand what we're about.
Sure, this is Kyle Talenti. I'm the president of RKG Associates, the consultant that has worked on this project. And I simply just want to agree with Shaylin. While we do recommend removing the two-tiered system, it does make more sense to us for the ownership side for the exact reason that Shaylin brought up, which is on the rental side, it is challenging to fill those units. We have not experienced that here in Newton. No one has reported that, and that has not been the case in other communities. So retaining the 110% of AMI for ownership makes sense.
Okay. So we just understand that this is part of the prospect of figuring out what units are deemed affordable to whom and what is the threshold. So this is one of the key issues involved in inclusionary zoning, because what you count is a unit that's affordable, and this is defining what's affordable and to whom. So I just want to be clear on what the concept is about. So let me pause for a second. I want to recognize Councilor Wright, whose hand in. I saw Councilor Albright, Councilor Getz, Councilor Kalis, and I'll go up, and I can't see who else has got his hand up. Councilor Lucas? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, my question is, and maybe it's for planning, have you, for condos, the 110% units, how are they easy to sell or difficult, or and compared to the 80% AMI?
This is Shaylin from the planning department, and in my experience, they have been pretty easy to sell. I haven't heard of any real issues with selling the middle income units.
Okay, great. And what happens when someone's income goes above the 110%? Maybe they're at 125. Do they have to leave and sell their place to someone who qualifies, or what's that
No.
process?
This is Shaylin again. So once you're in your condo, and as long as you meet the income requirements to purchase the condo, you can stay in that condo as long as you want, really. There's no real authority to force you to sell your condo. However, when you go to resell your condo, you are capped on what you can sell it at. There's a maximum resale price to keep that condo affordable for a future buyer.
Yep, I understand that. Okay, thank you very much.
Counselor Albright?
So Shaylin, something you said I didn't understand. You said developers are choosing 110%. What did that mean?
So the ordinance for that tier 2 unit is kind of flexible. It's for a range of incomes between 80 and 110% of AMI. There's no, like a tier 1, you have to average 65% of AMI, but tier 2, you do not have to average. So in theory, a developer could choose to set a unit at 90% of AMI. In practice, they are not. They are choosing 110% of AMI because they're able to charge more in rent at 110% of AMI.
Okay, so what I want to be clear on, we could have fixed that by saying the middle income has to be an average of 75% or whatever would be the average, not 75.
80 between 80 and 110.
The average
95.
between 80 and 110, whatever that number is. And we never chose to do that. So you regardless of that, you want to get rid of the tier 2.
Yes, sorry, this is Shaylin again. I forgot to identify myself last time. Yes, that's true. And I think the 110 really came out of analyzing like municipal salaries and teacher salaries in Newton, maybe 5 to 7 years ago, the last time the ordinance was redone. So I think that's ultimately where the 110% came from for both rental and ownership units.
Well, actually, where it came from is my second question. We borrowed this from Somerville. Somerville was doing this and we said, oh, that looks good. Let's try that. They're doing it. Let's do it too. Did Somerville get rid of theirs too?
I think Kyle can speak to this as well, but I believe they're actively looking to get rid of it.
Okay.
Yes, so this is Kyle Talenti with RKG again. We're actually working with Somerville right now on updating their IZ policy, and one of the considerations is doing away with their tier that goes up to 110% because they are experiencing some of the similar challenges that Newton is, that it's difficult to find a tenant who's willing to go through the income qualification process that meets the 110 level.
Okay. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Okay, so I have Counselor Getz, then Counselor Kalis on that.
Okay, thank you. This is for Mr. Talenti. I actually am curious about, us moving forward in terms of fulfilling this 110 AMI, in the community. And you're suggesting that it's not through the inclusionary zoning, and this is a broad, sorry, I feel like I'm out of the scope here, in terms of wanting to target that income level. How best to do that? That's something that he's here and I'd like to ask him that, but it doesn't have to be answered right now.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Did you hear the question? Sorry.
Yeah, I did. This is Kyle with RKG. So the challenge will always be that if you require them to income qualify people, then it's going to be difficult, or at least it's been proving difficult for them to find tenants who are willing to go through the process. If you remove the requirement for them to income qualify people, then you run the risk that they won't actually rent it to someone who earns 110% of AMI. And so you're kind of in a little bit of a quandary in that regard, in terms of trying to regulate the delivery of units at rental units at 110% of AMI.
So there's no solution for this.
Not a good one, I guess, would be my response to that. Is you can leave the 110 and not make them income qualify and hope that they are going on the honor system and will find a tenant at 110% of AMI and put them in the unit. But unfortunately, the challenge is the process and not the affordability in this regard, because there are other options both in Newton and other communities, that they can rent a unit at that price point without having to go through all that scrutiny and review of their income.
All right.
Okay, Counselor Kalis.
Yeah, so I don't know who this will go to, but probably a few people. The objective with this inclusionary zoning has always been to encourage developers to build more units that are affordable. If you get rid of the 80 to 110, and naturally to me, they're skewing towards the 110 because they make more money there. So if you get rid of 80 to 110, aren't we running the risk of very few units being built? And the second part of that question is there a way to kind of make this a tiered system whereby you are allowed to build the 80 to 110, but only after you've built a certain number of 50 to 80s?
I'm not sure.
This is Kyle with RKG. I will answer it from a market perspective, if that's okay, which is our recommendation to get rid of tier 2 is to then transfer those units, the percentage set aside, towards tier 1. And so I don't believe you're going to be losing. So I think the biggest difference between our recommendation and that is it's a slight reduction in set aside percentage in exchange for getting a lower AMI. So the impact to the development is the same, but regardless whether you keep it or you don't keep it, they have to deliver all the units simultaneously. They don't get to pick and choose when those units are delivered. And so whether you have just a 1-tier system where they're delivering units or you have a 2-tier system, all the units have to come online. And Shailene, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe they need to have those units built before they can even get a CO, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, you're talking about, I didn't understand the answer based on the question. You're talking about the delivery of units versus, for me, it's how do we get more 50 to 80s and fewer 80 to 110s when the incentives by getting rid of the 80 to 110s are not there anymore?
Forgive me. This is Kyle with RKG again. Is that what we've learned through this process is actually it's more of a financial challenge for them to fill the 110s. And so our analysis shows that the adjustments that we're recommending will actually create a stronger project because they won't have the uncertainty of those units going unrented for a length of time. It is extremely likely that they're going to be rented at 50 or 80% or the average of 65% very, very quickly. And so it's actually a financial benefit, if you will, at least in the short run, so that those units get filled up quicker and you remove some of that uncertainty. I apologize if I didn't answer that question clearly.
You're saying just the filling of the units at the 65-ish mitigates the time that it takes to rent the 80 to 110 so they make more money?
In the short term,
Yeah.
yes.
I think what I'm hearing is that the financial feasibility in the 2-tier system has a component which is uncertain, the 80 to 110. And because of that uncertainty, developers are more reluctant to go into these things. If they had a single tier and they knew what they were dealing with and they know they could rent those out, then they can do their pro formas and they can put the project together in a way that's financeable and will more likely to come through our gate and produce more units.
Okay,
That's what I'm hearing.
that makes sense, as long as they'll still build.
Yep.
That's the important thing.
If I misunderstand anything, correct me, please.
Just,
Yeah.
if I may, and that's,
Yeah.
just to clarify, that's for rentals.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes.
Right.
Just making
Yeah,
sure.
just thank you
Great.
very much for
Yeah,
that
okay.
clarification. We're talking about rentals because we're talking. Let me go to, I think, Councilor Lucas, and then I can't quite see who else's hand is up.
Danberg.
What?
Denver.
Catherine Danberg, thank you. Councilor-
Thank you, Chair. I have some questions on the 110% tier 2 ownership condo ones. Earlier you said you're not hearing of difficulties. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. You're not hearing of any difficulties of people buying and selling the 110s. Did I hear that correct?
This is Kyle from RKG, yes.
Okay, so we're not hearing any difficulty, but yet the recommendation is to remove it, correct?
Yes.
Just
Well, the RKG's recommendation, RKG's recommendation.
RKG's recommendation is to remove 110 ownership, even though folks, what you're hearing is they're not having any difficulty selling or buying those particular tier 2 units. But
Lucas, I think they've agreed with the department's recommendation to retain it for ownership, but not for rental. So there was an initial discussion where their first recommendation was to remove it completely, but as I heard the representation from RKG, they're agreeable to the recommendation of the planning department that they retain it for ownership, but not for rental.
so you want to retain the 110 for ownership?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I thought I had that backwards. All right, so we're retaining the 110 for ownership, and you're basing this off anecdotal evidence. Just wondering, do you have any actual data which says this? The reason why I ask is because there's quite a few condos that have been built recently in the last 5 to 10 years. I'm thinking of the one behind Barry's Market. I don't know if there are any that are 110 AMI. There's a condo development on California Street, Court Street. I don't know if those projects have any 110 AMI, but it'd be good if we had data that we could look at and say, okay, they are having a difficult time. They are not having a difficult time. That's all.
Okay, I can't comment about data, but I'll ask the planning director if you have anything.
Yeah, I was gonna say there, Shaylin, there's a certain amount of units that need to be built before you can even provide a 110 unit. I forget what that number is, but isn't it pretty significant?
Yes, the 110 or the tier 2 doesn't actually come into play until you hit, I believe it's 21 units for ownership projects. There's a table right here, actually. 20 or 17 units for ownership projects. So off the top of my head, Councilor Lucas, I'm not entirely sure of where the 110 units are, but I know that I've reviewed many an inclusionary housing plan in the last 2 to 3 years that do include those 110 units.
And we don't know if they're being sold or bought, like the 80 AMIs.
They're being sold, certainly. I don't know the speed at which they're being sold, but to Kyle's earlier point, the restrictions that come with a rental project at 110% of it AMI are really quite burdensome. But owning a condo at 110% of AMI seems to be where people at that income level would prefer to be.
The planning director had a point.
Yeah, just one way to look at this, if you have 110% AMI, you can find a rental fairly easily. If you have 110% AMI, you can't find a condo anywhere. So there's a real advantage.
All right, so we want to keep the 110s. Yeah?
110 for condo ownership, but not for rental.
Yeah, I'm only talking about ownership. So we want to keep the 110s for ownership. Yeah?
Well, that's the recommendation we're
Yeah, that's all right. I'm all set, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Councilor Danberg.
Thank you. Yes, on 110s for rental. If the developers are saying that the problem is the amount of paperwork that is burdensome, and that people at 110 for rental don't want to go through it. I get that, and I can understand that very well. My question is, are the developers okay with it financially if the people who rent, let's say they stay 20 to 30 years, this is their forever condo? I heard someone say that for the short term, it works. What about for the long term?
So I'm not sure I understand the question you're asking. You want to know?
Are developers able to make it financially if those 110s are converted to let's say 50 to 80 percent to 65%. Are they okay financially and willing to do this? If tenants stay long-term, 20 or 30 years, does that still work for them? Is my question.
Guess my understanding, and please correct me, Alex, is that the lower tier, if it becomes the only tier for rental, gives a sure range that the developer can rent and knows that they can fill. Once they've got those filled, both short and long term, the short term and the long term are essentially the same thing in the sense that they have to be able to go to a financing authority of some sort, make the case that they can build this and rent it out completely in order to satisfy their financing obligations, right? Mr. Heath?
Yeah, just one other point that would not want to see get lost in this, and I think Kyle mentioned it, which is it's not just that the 110 units are hard to fill. The desire is to provide more housing at the 80% and 50% level, and the only way to do that is to cut out the 110%, so that you can squeeze out a few more units at that level.
I don't think it does. It keeps it at 15%.
As you go higher, it does. As you get beyond 20.
It goes to 17, is that right?
That's correct.
But Councilor Danberg, I'm not sure I've answered or we've answered your question. I think the short and the long term, as I hear it, is the same in the basic way the project is structured. But are you asking whether there's some if we make this change, there's a long-term disadvantage somewhere?
Well, I think my bottom line question is, can we be assured that the developers will not go under if they are required to have all of the units at 50 to 80 and not spread them to 80 to 110? In other words, what I'm hearing is that because it's so hard to rent the 110s, the 80 to 110s, they're staying vacant, and the developers are getting zero, as opposed to they're being much better off if they get 65% from an earlier date. Is that the case?
So this is Kyle from RKG.
Yes.
May I, Mr. Chair? Okay, so they don't stay vacant forever. And so what the chairman was saying is 100% correct. Is the bigger issue they're having is that when you go to get your financing, the lenders have to be assured that you're going to be able to make your numbers. And our analysis shows, the math shows, that by adjusting the set aside and removing tier 2, you are not adversely financially affecting the project, and you're actually creating more surety, because the likelihood of those units being rented earlier on, which has a impact on return, because it's the length of the revenue that you're collecting, not just the amount, creates more certainty. So the math is showing us, the market data is showing us that it will not have a negative effect on the developments by shifting the tier 2s to tier 1s at the ratio that has been recommended.
That answers my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. So anyone else on this item, on this particular component? If not, I want to just get a sense of the committee. We don't have to take a straw vote unless there's a real difference of opinion. But it seems to me that we have the kind of consensus recommendation from our consultants in our department that we eliminate tier 2 for rental and we retain it for ownership. And is there any dissent from that? If not, let's assume that, Ms. Holden, if you just make a note of that, please, and then we will go on to the next component. All right, Mr. Director?
Shaylin?
Okay, thank you so much. This is Shaylin from the Planning Department once more. The second recommendation RKG made to the ordinance is to keep the graduated percentage formula based on the project size. However, as Kyle had mentioned earlier, to just adjust that percentage, so we capture some more units at an average of 65% of AMI. So the tables here show you what the current breakdown that is required in the ordinances. So you'll see it's a 15%, 17.5%, and a 20% for rental projects. And again, with a graduated unit count system. So it depends on how many units you come forward with in your project. And it is the same thing for ownership projects here as well. You'll see that there's kind of a 3-pronged system for rental projects and a 4-pronged system for ownership projects. You'll see that also that both, once you hit 100 units, 100 plus units, you are required to make 20% of those inclusionary units, whether they are condos or ownership projects or rental projects. So RKG's recommendation, again, is to keep that graduated system and just adjust it slightly. So for rental projects between 7 and 20 units, will remain at 15%. At an average of 65% of AMI. For rental projects between 21 and 99 units, the affordability requirement would be adjusted up to 17, or excuse me, down slightly from 17.5% to 17%. And for rental projects over 100 units, it would be adjusted down from 20% to 18%. And again, we would be losing overall total units that would be restricted. However, we would be getting more units at an average of 65% of AMI. So I can kind of go down and show you what that looks like in a second as well. The partnership, I want to note, thinks it would simplify the ordinance slightly to just have a flat 17.5% recommendation for all project sizes. So what that would look like for a 100 unit rental or 100 unit rental project under current IZ ordinance, you would be required to provide 15 units at an average of 65% of AMI and 5 units at 110% of AMI. So practically speaking, that's 20 total inclusionary units, 7 at 50%, 7 at 80%, 1 at 65%, and 5 at 110%. Under RKG's recommendations, for again a 100 unit rental projects, it would be 18.5 total units at an average of 65% of AMI. So practically speaking, again, it's 18 total inclusionary units, 9 at 50, 9 at 80, and then a cash payment of $325,000. I added that in there, but we'll talk about cash payments a little later. So for now, we're just looking at 9 units at 50, 9 at 80. And then under the partnerships recommendations, it would be 100, again, units times that 17.5%. So 17.5 units at 65%. Again, that would be 8 units at 50, 8 units at 80, 1 unit at 65, and a cash payment of $325,000. And do we want to pause here for rental projects or go straight through to home ownership?
Pause for rental, because this is a place where we have.
Okay.
I mean, these are, and I want to give everybody a chance to understand the ramifications. But the process of going to tier 1 is sort of marbled in this recommendation, because we're not seeing tier 2 in the recommendation, because we've assumed that's gone away for rental. And so the percentages are built around the assumption that we're in tier 1, as I understand it, just to be clear about what, how these one decision rolls through our conversation. The vice chair had a question.
Thank you. I think Councilor Wright should go next. I think her hand was up before mine,
Okay.
but I'm happy to go.
Why don't you go and I'll come back to Councilor Wright.
Actually, I have a question on ownership, so I'll skip this part.
So if I were to channel the director from a moment ago, what we're effectively saying is, even though we're reducing the number of units here by half in some cases and 2, I think in one case, right? 2.5, I think in one case. What we're saying is that's because they're at a lower AMI, that's actually better for the developer. Because the 110s, the 80 to 110s stay vacant longer. Therefore, the lower AMI units are filled at a higher rate over a longer period of time. And therefore, this is actually better. Am I kind of changing that up a little bit? Or did I get that mostly right?
This is Kyle with RKG. You are accurate. This is a financial equivalency with more certainty.
So Counselor Over.
So I'm thinking about the housing partnerships suggestion. If you do 17 and Kyle, this is for you, if you do 17.5 for the lower end of units, as opposed to 15, can they afford it? Can they manage it? And then on the high end, are we letting them get us, quote unquote, get away with something if we take it to 17.5 instead of 18.5?
So the answer to your first question is, I think it would create financial challenges that would create a little bit of uncertainty for those smaller projects, which is the reason why we left it at 15. For the larger projects, I think I would categorize it as you've made the policy more simple rather than you're letting them get away with something. But yes, they would end up delivering less.
So I'm thinking that if I know I'm gonna develop 100 units, I can look at the chart and see it's 18%. And if I know I'm gonna develop 65 units, I can look at the chart and see it's 17.5. I don't know, I can see the reason of keeping it at 15 for the lower end. But I think that they can figure out 17.5 and 18.5 and where the break point is. So I'm in favor of keeping the 18.5 for the higher end of number of units and leaving it at 15 for the lower end.
All right. Other comments on this? Councilor Christman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not quick enough to do this on my own, so I apologize, but I'm just wondering how these proposals impact developers who are on the margins between categories. Did you look at whether, someone who's going to do 21 units is more incentivized to do 20, et cetera? You know what I mean?
Well, there's the bracket problem of a choice, a number of units. Well, there's only one tier now we're talking about for rental. You said I thought you were saying two tiers. You mean you're talking about numbers rather than the percentage.
Not tiers, number of units.
Okay. So RPG, you want to comment a little bit about that? Because obviously there is a point in which the table can be read, as Councilor Albright indicated, by anyone. And they can say, well, with this number, I'm lower, and that number, I'm higher. So do I design my project around the table, or what do I design it around? So
the answer to his question is yes. If the site can yield 22 units physically, then they're going to do the math. Is it better to do 20 at 15% or 22 at 17.5? And so there is a chance that those borderline projects may end up reducing the overall number of units because it yields a higher return. That goes away when the property can yield 27 or 30 or 40 or 60, because giving up that much market rate is going to be very challenging, because you're going to be now paying an absorbent amount for the land compared to what the market would be willing to buy it for. That was a challenge in the previous policy, and unless it goes to a single percentage, it will be a challenge for those margin projects now.
So what I'm hearing is that RPG, just to be clear, you recommend keeping a somewhat lower percentage for the smaller projects in order to encourage those to come forward, rather than necessarily going with a housing partnership of across the board. But the flip side of that is that when you get a bigger project, we want more units so that we average out, we hope, with more units overall.
And this is Kyle with RKG, and the math bears that out. As you get into those larger projects, they can absorb a higher set aside.
Okay. So any other questions? Did we respond to you, Councilor Christman?
Yes, I just want to sort of finish, because the 100 I feel like is less frequent. I think we're more frequently looking at the 16 to 17 units that, you know, we're looking at that line, or 20 to 21, I should say, in terms of rental. And I'm also wondering whether, because I think you said, you know, if the space can hold 22 units, you might see them opt for 20, or, you know, they might game it, obviously based on the finances. I'm wondering if part of that can be smoothed out with the roundup rule as well, or if, you know, other parts of these recommendations could factor into that sort of smoothing out, so you don't see the cliff effect of people who are building, you know, specifically developments with a particular number of units just based on the financial calculation.
We have that, and we haven't talked about the kind of bonus, or not bonus, but the additional cash payment that is designed to do exactly what you indicated, which is to smooth the transition between brackets.
Right.
And we'll get to that, but we have to get at least the threshold question, I think, of understanding the brackets. Let's assume we can, if we do reach a conclusion there, we can get to a cash payment that would normalize it, but we need to understand what we want to normalize. Councilor Wright.
This is probably for the planning department, but my observation in Newton in general, and this is general, not always, if it's 30 units, maybe 35, it's usually condos. And if it's more than that, it's usually rentals. Very rarely do we see 20-unit building that are rentals. I think there's just one that recently came up, but generally, I think around 30, 35 is the cutoff between condos and rentals. Is that correct?
I think that's accurate. I also think it's probably marbled into development finance. Kyle can probably speak to that as well.
So yes, in those cases, probably what's happening is because land is more valuable as an ownership project at that scale than as a rental, the owner developers are able to outbid renter developers for smaller projects for the land.
So we have a recommendation from RPG and the planning department, which I think are coincident. The housing partnership would like a flat schedule. Let's just get a sense of the committee. Members of the committee have, I don't need a straw vote yet, but I just want to get a sense. And how many people are in favor of the tiered system? In other words, a bracketed system is recommended by the department and RPG.
Before we do that, I'm still hazy on what are the details. I hear, it sounds like similar number of units we're going to be getting. Just,
I think the production end is as I hear it, part of the rationale for these changes is to gradually increase the chances that we will, now with no assurance in any market, that we will get more units that are deemed affordable and in the rental pool. That's the objective of that.
I think we're getting less. We're actually slightly less.
Well, the question is slightly less of more, or slightly more of less.
Slightly less, but developers might be happier, we might get more.
okay, slightly less, but in this case, between the partnership and RKJ, what is the real difference?
Planning director may be able to.
Yeah, exactly. In the case that Shane outlined for 120, so under the RKG 18.5, you get 18 units, under the partnership 17 flat, 17. So,
but except for the like as Princeton alluded to, we don't really get 100 unit. I mean, we're really getting these smaller units. So what's the difference?
no, on the rental side, we do get larger projects. Like, so for example, Northland and obviously Riverside are going to be rental properties. So that's where this comes into play.
Yeah.
But
I think
no, wait a minute. I want an orderly discussion here.
Sorry.
So you had a question. I think we've got a policy choice here. Do we go with RPG, which has a slightly higher number for the larger units, and a slightly lower number for the smaller project? Or do we go, I'm gonna simplify it a bit, or do we go for a flat, as the housing partnership recommends? Let me just get a sense of it, Councilor.
So I can't, just want to comment on that, I think. The reality of developer mindset into account. And the lower end, 50%, the lower end developer. And on the higher end, you can sort of give a little bit. So I think developers into account, and that's why I like that number.
Okay. Answer that?
No, I'm not wanting, you're flagging, you wanted to say something.
Oh, well, I was
I'm
just.
sorry, there's a person I can't see. Ms. Spencer, come sit at the table with us. You're effectively invisible. Not really, it's just that planning director is, I wouldn't call him opaque, but he's in my line of vision, so I can't see.
Thank you, Laura Piper, planning department. I was just, you had asked about
Thank you.
what the impact would be for small projects, so that, as Casal writes, I think that's exactly the thing that RKG has looked at, they've reached out to the developers. They can accommodate the 15%, that's normalized now, that's what they expect.
Okay.
But, you know, there's a concern if we raise that for lower projects, that's gonna raise some uncertainty, and that might
Okay.
cause problems for the smaller projects, which we do see quite a few of.
So, Councilor Wright, is that, whose hand is up? Whose hand is up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then-
Yes, thank you. I like the tier system, again, for rental units. We don't see many at under 20, and we don't see many under 30. They're usually the bigger ones, so we will get more units overall. So I think we should keep it as the tier system as it is. I mean, we should do more discussion on the smaller projects for condos, because that's where it happens, really.
Okay, and I think you're agreeing with the idea of the RKG's recommendation for brackets.
Yep.
Okay, Councilor Kritzman, did you have another comment?
I do. Maybe I don't understand the RKG recommendation, because for more than 100 units, right now, as you just said, we're getting project, or we have a few projects, and I include Riverside in that, where developers are planning on building 20%. And this would lower it to 18.5%. So my concern there is that we've seen a few of them, over 100 unit development, that are planning to be rentals. And they seem to be doing okay with that. They seem to be able to comply with that. So why would we lower the threshold and get fewer units on those major big developments?
So, RKG, can you respond to that?
Yes, so this is Kyle with RKG. The reason is that right now they're doing the certain percentage at average of 65 and the certain percentage at 110. By removing the 110 and leaving the set aside percentage as it is at 20% for over 100 units, that has a negative financial impact compared to what the current policy is. That's the reason why when we did the math, the 18.5% at a flat 65% is about financially equivalent to the current policy, which is 15% at average of 65 and 5% at 110. That's why we lowered the AMI threshold, which has a negative financial impact. And so we created a counter adjustment to the set aside to get to a financial neutrality.
For the developer, but if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying financially it's the same, but the city gets fewer units.
Yes, you get fewer units, but you get more at a lower targeted AMI.
Well, I go back to Councilor Kalis's point that the whole purpose of the inclusionary zoning ordinance was to generate affordable units. So, I mean, I'll listen to the discussion, but it strikes me that we wouldn't want to take a step backwards, in at least in one area where this seems to have been working, but I'll listen to others.
So let me just try and clarify. I'm going to call on the planning director. The idea here, as I hear it from RKG, is that once you get rid of tier 2, you're structuring the project so that you have more units filled, but they're filled at a lower effective rental. Therefore, in order to make the project financially attractive and viable, you have to reduce the percentage that you have at the far end. The question here is, are you going to get buildings built and the incentive structure, as I hear it, is designed to make sure that people still go and do projects rather than say, well, it's like the exercise you do is better than the better exercise you don't. But Mr. Director?
Yeah, just real quickly, I think it's a value proposition, which is, do you get more units overall? Or do you get more deeply affordable units? And I think that the partnership and planning staff would like to see more affordable units. And perhaps give up a little bit on the number overall.
So.
I think, yeah.
Okay, so let me just get a sense of committee. I hear some dissent from Councilor Krinsman. But I think, as I'm hearing, most of the committee is in favor of the RKG, not RPG. I keep changing. I confuse you with a former Supreme Court justice. But that was,
Mr. Chair, if I could just.
that was a different set of issues anyway, but I got enough confusion. So the members of the committee, you want to go with the RKG recommendation? I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, can I just make one point? I guess my fellow committee members have their mind made up, and that's cool. That's where we're headed. But I think Director Heath just articulated beautifully. I think my preference would be, if there's a tiebreaker or something, to lean in terms of number of units rather than deep affordability. And I say that in part because if we think about things like 40B and where there are requirements on the city, it's exclusively based on the number of units and thresholds that we have to meet. We're not looking at and we're not judged on the affordability of those units, but certain goals that we have and thresholds we try to meet are based on the number of units.
That's a fair point. I don't think that there's an automatic, Mr. Director.
Yeah, just an additional point that hasn't come up, and I don't know how relative it is, but the 110% units don't count toward our SHI numbers at all. So.
That's interesting. Okay. Councilor.
I have a comment.
Councilor, Brian, I'll come back to you, but.
Okay.
So Councilor Princeton's question, in 40B, there's a kind that's 80%, all 80%, there's a kind that's lower. Can you remind us?
50% at 20 and 25% at 80.
What?
So in a 40B project, you can do 20%, but the units have to be at 50% AMI. Or you can do 80% AMI, but you have to be at 25%.
And what do the 40B developers usually do?
Generally speaking, they go for the 25% at 80. Yeah, because.
So if we're only at 80, oh no, but we're going for the average of 65.
Yeah.
So it's a slightly less number at 65, so we get more at 50, where the 40B developers don't give us any 50s. They tend to give us only 80s.
That's correct.
Okay.
I mean, part of the rationale here, as I hear it, is that our inclusionary zoning is designed to produce lower rental units that we're not getting from the 40B process.
Right.
And so we want to try and make it as attractive to developers to go that route rather than to go the 40B route, which they could do without having to talk to us at all.
Correct, but.
Sorry, Vice Chair.
No.
Well, Councilor Wright has been patient. I told her I'd come back to her. Then I'll go to Councilor Taylor. Sorry.
Thank you. Before we make a decision on this, maybe there's a slide farther down about what other communities are doing and what their percentages are, and see if we're in line with them or if we're way out of line or whatever. But I think that might be a little bit helpful here for this discussion.
I want to try and get provisional. We're going to revisit all of these at the end after we get done.
Okay.
So we can answer that question as we go by. But I think just in the interest of moving the conversation forward, I'd like to try and maintain the recommendation from our consultant as the committee's not consensus, but I think the majority of the committee are in favor of that, with Councilor Krinsman's dissent. And who we got on the screen that I can't see the name, I'm sorry, my vision is terrible. Counselor Bly, it's not that you're invisible, it's just you're illegible. Oh, Counselor Kalos was here first, I'm sorry, let me recognize him, I'm trying to operate between the analog and the digital universe, and I'm not very successful.
So I just want to make, I think Councilor Princeton has a good point. We've always wanted more units. But at the same time, and equally as important, we always want lower affordability. And that's one of the things we're always asking about. So this is an opportunity, I think, to get lower affordability, fewer units, but lower affordability. I think we take it.
Okay. All right, Counselor Block. Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you. I've missed your earlier part of your conversation, so my comment may have been, covered already, but when I read the RKG report, I thought part of the reason for their recommendation is that the 110% category isn't working out too well, that people who can afford, who would qualify at that level, have access to the private real estate market. So it's maybe a nice idea, but the people who would qualify are more than capable of finding other types of housing and not wanting to jump through the hoops to participate in this, which seems to be another good reason to focus our attention on the, people who are at lower AMI and support them. So that's just
Yeah.
sort of additional comment on why the RKG proposal is, I think, an attractive one.
Spot on. Your assumptions up front were spot on, sir.
Yeah,
We agree with you.
we, that was part of the reason we got here, and, but you didn't hear the earlier discussion, but you summarized it eloquently. So, you must have extrasensory perception or something, but anyway. All right, let's carry on, but thank you very much. So I assume that's, support for that. So let's say a provisional, choice in the committee to go with brackets along the lines of the recommendation for RKG, okay? And now go to the next, point of discussion. We'll come back and just make sure we're all comfortable with this by the time we get done.
So Shaylin again from the planning department, not moving on to another recommendation, really, we're staying in that, under that same recommendation, just moving to homeownership projects instead of rental projects. So RKG, has recommended keeping, kind of a staggered system of number of affordable units for homeownership projects, but slightly adjusting that to homeownership projects between 7 and 16 units remains at 15%. Homeownership projects between 17 and 20 units adjust the affordability down to 12%. Homeownership projects between 21 and 99 units would adjust the affordability to 16.5% at 80% of AMI. And for home ownership projects for over 100 units, we would adjust the affordability requirement down again to 18% at 80% of AMI. So this is under the assumption that we are removing tier 2 from home ownership projects, which does not seem to be my understanding is does not seem to be the opinion of the committee. So if we wanted to just keep it the same, the requirements for home ownership projects under the current tiered, or not tiered system, but really this kind of bracket system, as we've been calling it, is 7 to 16 units at 15% at 80% of AMI, 17 to 20 units, 10% of the units would be at 80%, 5% would be at 110%. For 21 to 99 units, it would be 10% at 80, 7.5% at 110% for that total of 17.5%. And again, for over 100 units, it's 10% at 80, 10% at 110%. So that's if we kept everything the same and did not, or kept tier 2, I should say, did not adjust the tier 1 percentage for tier 2 units. And then just again, I thought it would be helpful to show what that looks like. So under a home ownership or a condo projects at 100 units, under the current IZ ordinance, we would be talking about 20 total inclusionary units, 10 of those at 80% of AMI, 10 of those at 110% of AMI. And then under the RKG original recommendation, where you're getting rid of tier 2 or 110% of AMI, it would be 18 units at 80% of AMI, just flat. So we would be gaining 8 units under this provision, gaining 8 units at 80%, but we would be losing again that middle income tier of 110%. So we would be losing 2 units overall, and we'd be losing 10 units at 110% of AMI.
So,
I'll pause there.
thank you for taking us through that. So let me just be clear if I understand you correctly. The purpose of the RPG adjustment was that you were getting rid of 110% for home ownership. And that means that, as I hear it, the department recommends retaining our current tiered structure, not modifying the tiered structure. Would RKG agree with that if we do keep the 110%?
Absolutely. If you keep the two-tier system for ownership, disregard our recommendation. Our recommendation was made on the assumption you're moving to a single tier.
Okay. So this would not, as I hear it, there would not be a change in the ordinance recommended under this sort of modified version of our process and proposals. Councilor Kalin.
RKG or Director Heath, did you talk to developers about having 2 systems, one for rentals and one for ownership, and does that matter? Does it skew the way the builders then want to go to market?
Kyle, you spoke to developers, we did not.
We did not talk to them about having a separate system for owner and rental. It is our experience that it's usually a very different process, and I don't believe it would have any effect from our experience.
So
Having 2 different systems, one for rental, one for owner.
we have Councilor Wright on that. Now I'll come back to Councilor Getz, but I know Councilor Wright is.
So I just wanted to understand, I don't want to go with your suggestion, but 17 to 20 units was at 12% at 80% AMI, which is less than the 7 to 16 units. So I didn't understand why you have a lower threshold for that little spot. And if you take a look at what we use now, I think we also have you make it more difficult for 7 to 16 units versus 17 to 20, because for 7 to 16 units, you need 15% at 80% AMI, and the 17 to 20, the total is 15%, but only 10% is at 80% AMI, and then the other is at 110. So I think if we keep the 2-tier, which I think we should with the 110, I think in the 17 to 20, I think that should get increased, because it's making it easier on the developers. And we have seen, for instance, I think on Watertown Street, that they throw in an extra unit. So I don't think this is a hardship for developers right now. So I'd like to see the 17 to 20 to be the same as the 21 to 99. And then the second thing is, when you're doing an example for ownership, we have, I think we have nothing in the last 10 years that were built with 100 units. So I think it would be realistic, if you're going to do an example, is use 30 units. Thank you.
Councilor Wright has raised the question of whether we should make an adjustment in our current schedule, which retains a 2-tier system. RKG, you want to respond to that?
I honestly can't answer that, because we didn't test whether or not. Our assumption is, since it's already in policy, that the market is normalized to it because it hasn't adjusted in 5 years, but we didn't run specific scenarios to try and answer whether that does or does not work. So I can't answer that at this very moment. I guess my response to that would be, if you're not changing the 2-tier system, I don't see a reason why you would reduce it at all. If you wanted to increase it, we could run some numbers and get them to Barney to let them know that what that would look like. But I don't see a reason why you would reduce the set aside if you're not changing the tiers.
And I'm not saying to reduce it. I was saying for the 17 to 20, I'm looking at the table there, is to increase it. Maybe make it the same as the 21 to 99 units. But if you take a look at the 17 to 20 versus the 7 to 16, it's more costly for the developer for the lower units, lower number of units, because they have to have 15% of the units at 80% AMI versus the 17 to 20 is only 10%. And then the other 5% is at 110% AMI. I mean, you might be doing that so that you get more 17 to 20 unit buildings instead of the 16. I don't know, but
I think the original question was on the adjustment of the shipping schedule for the homeowners. But I don't think we have clear, unless the department has new information that they haven't yet explained to us, to indicate what the impact of that would be. At least that's my understanding at the moment. Now, we can ask for more clarification on that, but does the department have any view on that question that Councilor Wright has raised? But she wants to raise the number slightly and not reduce it, which is not a different, it's a different outcome. And we just need to understand, is that likely to be counterproductive to the market and generating the units, or is it going to be, or is the market going to be able to absorb the additional set aside? That's really the question.
So
Question?
So Laura Kreitzer, Planning Department, I think as I said, because our KG was assuming that we would get rid of the tier 2 across the board for the commercial rental, that's what they looked at. We haven't seen any reason to change this, but we could certainly look at other options and what that might spell out to be.
So let me make a suggestion, if it's all right to move this process forward. If we end up going to a consensus that we maintain the current schedule, but ask you to examine before the public hearing time what the adjustment would be, because I do think the advertisement, this is where Mr. Lee comes in the law department, that if we advertise something that might involve an adjustment for this schedule, I would like to make sure that we have the scope to do that. If the analysis comes back and says that Councilor Wright's recommendation is sound, that we could get a little bit more, we're trying to adjust the current ordinance, maintaining the two-tier system for the home ownership, but we would like to think about adjusting the numbers inside the brackets for the reasons that she's indicated, but we don't have an analysis of that yet. Would that be okay, Councilor Wright?
yes, thank you.
Okay, because I'd like to move along with this, but you've raised an interesting question. I don't think we have the analysis to be able to resolve. Okay, let's go to the next item.
Okay, sorry, Shaylin from the Planning Department again. The third recommendation is to leave the area median income threshold at an average of 65% of AMI for rental projects. And this came out of a conversation that housing advocates have had, and I think ZAP has had in the past as well, about potentially lowering that average to 50% of AMI or 55% of AMI, something in that range. So we're capturing some more deeply affordable units. RKG's recommendation, however, is to leave that at an average of 65% of AMI, so it does not adversely affect the market. And we are all in consensus. The Planning Department, the partnership, and RKG are all in consensus and agree with this recommendation.
So basically, the recommendation is not to change anything at this point. Okay, anybody in the committee think from that?
Just to make sure we understand, this is for the 10 or more residential. Is that right?
This is the rental, yeah, for rental inclusionary. This is the highlighted section B.
Yeah.
Okay, this would basically leave the current relative income ratio the same. Councilor Wright, you have your hand up for this?
Yes. What I agree on principle right now to keep it, but I'd like to see what other cities and towns are doing. And again, that data is later on to see if we're more in line with them. Because we do get sometimes developers give us more units at even a lower AMI and things like that. So I think they can do this. And, you know, it would be nice to get some 30% AMI units or something. But again, if we can take a look at what other towns are doing around here.
Let's put an asterisk on this and keep going and then see where we are. Counselor Gant?
Yeah, the only other piece to dovetail with her is just looking back 5 years and seeing what has actually been created, you know, in terms of like where they are and, you know, just the number of units and the size of the project. So yes, I think that that's something that will inform this, you know, in terms of, you know, making decisions.
So the
Councilor Barbara?
Affordable Housing Trust, and I don't know why it hasn't come finished yet, but they've done an analysis of all these units. And it would be great for this community to see that work. You can get it to us.
I can see if it's available.
Yeah.
and start sharing.
All right, but for visually, let's carry on. I want to see how far we can go, and then come back. All right?
Thank you. Shaylin from the planning department again. I've shut off my video to hopefully improve my sound and just general reception here at home. So the next recommendation is to keep the minimum unit threshold for inclusionary zoning applicability at 7 units and to allow a by right cash in lieu payment option for 7 to 19 units. So we're looking at the highlighted pieces of the ordinance here. This came out of a conversation about potentially lowering the threshold to 4 units. For now, however, the recommendation is to keep it at 7 and then again allow a by right cash in lieu payment for 7 to 19 units. So sorry.
So the recommendation is to maintain the current arrangement, but I think that this is one place where it may be useful to explain a little bit more about why you came to that, because if there was one common thread among counselors, I recall, it's been the question of whether we should move the number down. And if so, what's the effect of that or not? And representing some eagerness on the part of counselors not to have people just basically building 6-unit projects to avoid playing in this game at all. So there may be reasons to stay put, but I think we need to discuss this one a little bit. Is that fair, committee?
Yeah.
Okay, so who's taking the lead on this one, RKG or the department on this recommendation?
I'm happy to start things off.
Okay.
And Kyle can jump in if need be. Again, so much of this is a value proposition. So the value proposition here is, can you create more affordable units with the cash that you would derive from the 7 to 19 units then you would get versus providing the units themselves. So Ann Houston did a little bit of an analysis on that and determined that if we took a look at recent affordable projects that the city has had, the average subsidy that the city is providing is around $90,000. So for a 7-unit project, which you'd be required to provide 1 unit, an in lieu payment would be $682,000. Where if you took that $90,000 figure, you'd get 7 units provided. So I guess the understanding there from the Affordable Housing Trust is with the funds that they could be provided through an in lieu payment, they could generate many more units than you would get through IZ.
So for people who are watching, the Affordable Housing Trust is a vehicle we created in the city to take advantage of our community preservation funds to go and support some projects, but some of the funds that come into their range of opportunity are these dollars, and the question is what do we get? Is it better to get some money out of these projects rather than a single unit and let them fill up the pot, so to speak, from their point of view, or do we want to try and get it out of individual projects? That's the choice we're facing. Councilor Allen.
Great. So just real quick. So as we're thinking about this as kind of a value proposition or a comparison of 2 different value props, right? Is the cash in lieu of formula, if you will, inclusive of our ability to obtain land and build the project basically from scratch, if I'm understanding what we're trying to compare here, versus a developer who's already in the process of and is an expert at building or constructing a project. Like, it just seems to me that if we ask for the units, it's more efficient for them to provide the units than it would be for the city of Newton to provide the units. And I'm happy to be wrong on that, but is that what we're talking about?
Councilor Albright, can you
So the
clarify?
thing is that the Affordable Housing Trust wouldn't build the units, they would give money to an applicant who is the developer to build the units, so it's not the developer's doing the units, no matter who does it. Whether it's 7, 6, 5, whatever number it is.
Sure, but it's a new project.
It's a new project, but
With new land,
but the
yeah.
question is, would we get fewer developments if an IZ ordinance applied to 6 or fewer, so let's say 4 to 6 units, would anybody develop them at all? Versus if we ask for a payment in lieu, we can still get the projects at 7 and we get the money. Did I say that right?
No, thanks.
No, I think that's a question that's the basic issue. If you move the number down so that you have to provide an affordable unit for a smaller project, with the economics then not work, so the developers won't build the project at all.
Right.
I mean, one extra unit in a 4-unit project that isn't built is not as valuable to the city as a 6-unit project with no unit but cash. And that's the proposition the decision we're making. So that's really what we really want to try and understand. And Councilor Albright, I think, is, shaped the conversation properly. Councilor Taylor, and then Councilor Wright.
So it sounds to me like we all want to go down to 5 or 6 or 4. We all want to, but the market won't bear it. And I think that's the reality. And I think we just have to, instead of, I think, changing what we have, where it's been studied now, this is going to be the second time because we did it in 2019. And it's the same result now. I think we stick with it.
Okay. Councilor Wright.
I have a few concerns, or where this was going originally, what I wanted to see at 4 units, or maybe even at 3 units, is not an affordable unit, but money towards additional affordable units elsewhere. So they wouldn't have to, in a 4-unit building, maybe they have to pay $100,000 or, something like that. We come up with a number. Not that they actually have to put a unit there. I disagree on up to 19 units they can do cash in lieu of, because now you're segregating the city. It could happen where only the big projects would have these affordable units, or projects that the city does, that we don't do a lot of those. And then, and I see okay for in lieu of for the smaller projects, 7 to 10. But when you're going up to, 19 units, I want to see those affordable units there in that building and not put somewhere else.
So I think there are 2 different questions here.
Yep.
The lower end, what do you do at the higher end? So let's shape the conversation around one at a time. Okay. Let me hear from Councilor Danberg and then Councilor.
Thank you. The question in bringing this up at all, that we wanted to answer, or get a discussion on and hopefully get an answer to, is how low can we go in the number of units without in getting an affordable unit? We're now at 7. How low can we go without discouraging building? And I think that the most important thing is that we get the units built. If the planning department and consultant have come up with the suggestion that we leave it at 7. I'm okay with that. What I don't want to do is discourage building because we're trying to get too many units.
Thank you. Councilor Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. So looking at the screen right here, I think I might agree with Councilor Wright. I would not increase the buy right in lieu of cash in lieu of options. I would not move it up to 7 to 19. And as a matter of fact, I would completely get rid of it. I would not allow a developer to determine if they want to provide cash compared to units. And I remember of a project on Jackson Street near Route 9 a couple of years ago. I might have some of the details wrong on this one, so maybe Director Heath, you might remember this a little better than me. But the developer initially proposed to do a 9 or 12 unit condo building and make it a cash in lieu of options. The land use committee did not like that particular option. We wanted to see the units, and ultimately we got the units. That's a very small example, but it just goes to show that I don't see there being much support. I could be wrong. There could be much support for the cash option as opposed to the units. That's one thing. The other thing I want to say is, and this is at the last meeting we were discussing the IZ ordinance, I believe RKG was recommending a partial cash payment for units ranging from 3 to 6. And I just want to make sure that is still on the table. And if we're going to get to it later on in tonight's meeting, that's fine. But I just want to make sure that's still an option.
So let's clarify that, but I think there are two different questions. One is, what do we do with the threshold at 7? And we leave it alone. And then the second question is, what do we do with the cash payment if we leave it alone? And then what do we do with the option to provide cash as opposed to units for the higher end? There are really 3 issues that I think are before us as I hear it, subject to the planning director and others certainly can clarify that. So let's just see about the number of units. I think the question is, do we want to keep the threshold as it is because we want to encourage some projects to go forward, as Councilor Danberg indicated? That's the sense of the committee. We can talk about the cash piece in a minute. Anybody dissent from that? All right, so let's go for the second question, which is, Councilor Danberg, your hand is up. Is that on a different point? I just want to sort of move through. Is that left over?
I'm left over, sorry.
And Councilor Lucas, I'm assuming you're the same at that point.
I would like an answer to my question.
Well, we're about to go to there.
Okay.
So the second question is, if we maintain the unit threshold at 6, what is the appropriate cash payment? Does RKG have a recommendation about that as a response in lieu of changing the number, keeping the number, but providing some cash for
So this is Kyle with RKG. So to answer the question directly, at the $650,000 in lieu payment number, which is what it currently is set at, going below 7 units, even if you're allowing to do a partial payment and not having to deliver a whole unit, becomes financially challenging. If you wanted to go to 6 or 5 or 4, you would have to adjust the in lieu payment value amount lower than that to be able to make that financially neutral. So
we're holding at 6 for the moment, provision.
6 or 7.
Yeah, 6 or 7. I'm sorry. 7 is the number. Apologies, but more than 6. 7.
Yes,
And so the math bears out that unless you adjust the in lieu payment amount, it doesn't work to go below 7 right now.
Let's assume we're not going below 7. The question that I hear from Councilor Lucas and Councilor Wright is there some change in the ordinance that's recommended for the in lieu payment? I'm hearing none, but I just want to be clear.
I don't think that they can see.
I would like it, it doesn't have to be a fraction of the 650, just like RKG was saying, but maybe it's 50,000, 100,000, something. And because there's enough of those projects out there and it will add up. And so I'd like to see something like that. And I do have a question for RKG that they were going to get back to me on the last time when they used the $650,000.
Councilor Wright, time out for a minute.
Okay.
Don't go to the question yet, okay? I'll come back to you, but I just want to be clear. Right now, there's not a recommendation to add the in lieu payment for unit projects below 7, right? You're asking, should there be? Councilor Lucas is asking, should there be? And several members of the committee are asking, should there be? And if so, what is it that it should be, right? We don't have that as a recommendation yet from RKG or the planning department. But that is a question now being posed. Assuming we stay at the threshold of 7, starting. We haven't hit the higher number yet, Councilor Wright. I haven't forgotten that. But I just want to focus on this zone. Correct?
And also, Kyle can speak to this as well, but what happens is what we talked about previously, which is instead of getting whatever number you set it at, 4-unit projects, you'll get 3-unit projects, because they'll do whatever they can to avoid having to pay any money. So there'll be a gap between 4 and 7 where they actually have to create a unit, and they probably won't do the 4, 5, and 6-unit properties.
Even if the number was as low as 50,000?
I don't know if Kyle can speak to that, but it could have
Maybe
that.
we bring it down to 2 units.
Oh, let's pause for a minute. The question here is, and this is a, just to frame it for what I understand the history of this issue has been. Members of the council have been concerned that we're not getting projects that are smaller, that people are going for projects which are smaller but not paying because they want to stay avoid doing anything. So the question is, can we say, all right, we'll take those smaller projects, but we'll get something? And if so, what should the something be? That's right now, the recommendation is to leave the threshold at 7 and not ask for anything additional. But the question is, should we ask for something additional for those smaller projects? I'm just trying to get clarity from the consultant and the department about what their thinking is. If their thinking is leave it alone, that's okay, but I just want to be clear about that question because that's the issue that I think has been most at top of mind for many people about this ordinance. Ms. Pratchett.
Laura Kreitzer, Planning Department. I think what we've learned from RKG's research is that going below 7, it would be difficult for developers. I think and 7 units works with what we're using right now for our in lieu payment, the 650,000 that we use right now. That's normalized. That's what developers are used to. I think if we start looking below that, then we do need to start, as Kyle said, we're gonna have to start looking at how we do that calculation completely. And I think we're gonna have to take a whole nother look at how we do things. I think going below 7 and as far as 2 is, we're just gonna encourage projects that are smaller.
Well, I think the point, at some point, you don't have to pay anything, right, if you do this. But I think this is one of those issues that has been before the council, so I don't want to lose it until we can get clarity. Let me just recognize we've been joined by a counselor whose image is clear, but whose name is not to me. Councilor Maliki. Thank you, Councilor Maliki. My apologies again. This is you all are old enough to probably remember Little Abner, who had a character named Cousin Weak Eyes. That was-
I've been here all along too. So I think, kind of along the lines of what Councilor Wright is saying, I think we need a much broader application of requiring something. Anytime we're getting sort of more units than are being lost, usually something is being lost, you know, it might be a single family, it might be a 2-family. What we're getting now is up to 6 units, as big as they can be. I would like to see us sort of get rid of the cliffs at 6 and the cliff at 9 to 10. Eliminate, kind of smooth that out, so there's no incentive to game the system, basically. Because you know, you talk about maybe we won't get smaller projects, but what they can do, you know, it might make sense to build 7 small units, but they don't want to have to make a payment, so they build, you know, 4 gigantic units or something like that. If we required something for any number of units over the number of units that are being lost, it would eliminate that sort of bad incentive. We'd be sure to get something, and that would go toward the fund, or my preference would be lower the threshold at which we actually get units, because the units that we're seeing in the, you know, 4 or 5 unit range, they are selling for, it's hard to keep track, you know, they were $1.5 million units, and maybe now they're at $1.8 million units. And that's not helping affordability. It's just making us more of a luxury city.
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me go back to Councilor Lucas and then come back to. Councilor.
One other point I wanted to make. It's a little odd that we have a fixed dollar amount in lieu of a unit, or, you know, prorated partial unit or whatever, when the actual, it seems to have no relation to what units might sell for in the project. They could be selling for huge amounts or moderate amounts, and if we're getting a partial unit or a unit in a payment in lieu, it's the same amount regardless, which seems odd to me.
Thank you. Councilor Lucas?
Thank you. 2 things. One, again, I just want to stress I would abolish any buy right cash in lieu of units for any units 7 or above. I still would like an answer to my question. What is the plan, or is the plan still the same from the last meeting, for a cash payment, a partial cash payment for units 6 and under? Are we going to discuss that tonight, or is that settled?
That's what we're talking about right now.
Okay, so then I would say for 6 and under, I can't remember what was shared at the last meeting, but I would make it a percentage of the total development cost, which I think is 650,000. I would just make it a percentage. And twice before, a developer has made a cash payment for units under than 6. I think there was 2 different projects in Onantum, one on Nevada Street, one on Adams Street. The other question I have is, for any potential cash payment, is that split in half, between half going to the housing authority and half going to the trust, or does it all go to the trust? Does it all go to the housing authority? I would need I think the committee would need clarification on that too.
That piece we can clarify fairly quickly.
Yeah, it's 50% goes to the trust, 50% goes into the housing authority.
So we're not changing that division in any scenario as I hear it. So, but the question that Councilor Lucas has asked, does RKG have any recommendation for a cash payment for units below 7?
No pressure.
Well, look at these tables. It's not feasible.
No, I just want to hear, no.
Did we lose Kyle?
Is Kyle still there? and then I'll come back to you, Council.
I think he answered it already.
Yeah, he's
I
still
think you
there.
did, but we just want to be clear.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why all of a sudden my audio cut out on me, but so I don't have an answer of what the number is right off the top of my head. We measured it at the 650. So if you give me the night, I can give an answer back to staff tomorrow about what the number would need to be to make it so that it didn't create a financial challenge for projects under 7 units.
Okay, Councilor, Mr. Heath.
Yeah, so I just want to point out also that would be a rarity to bring it down to that level because other communities, and Councilor Wright alluded to this previously, that we looked at, start at 6 or 7, or in the case of Cambridge, they don't start till 10, where they apply inclusionary zoning. So we would become less attractive for development, period, in terms of affordable units, because our standard would be lower than surrounding communities.
So, okay, Councilor Kalish.
Begrudgingly, you calling me.
No, I'm just trying to.
So they don't have, this wasn't studied by RKG, so what and there's a lot of hypotheses that we all have. I think we all want to see some type of analysis here. The question I have right now is, do we lay this aspect on the table and go through everything else to update this inclusionary zoning? And this one section, maybe there might be another one, we actually have them do an analysis, because that hasn't been, it sounds like it hasn't been done here and it hasn't been done elsewhere. And there are multiple ways it can probably be done. Councilor Lucas talked about a percentage, there's also fixed dollars, whatever it might be. So and I don't know what the budget is, Director, on RKG for this year versus next year. So that's why I'm bringing this up. We're not gonna solve it now. But I want to solve the other stuff that we can.
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable suggestion. I hear some sentiment for some. I think the choices I've heard it is the market for development projects is for small projects. If someone can build here versus somewhere else, part of the attraction is not having to pay the percentage. On the other hand, if we want to try and have some contribution from the smaller projects, what should that number be without being such a disincentive that people don't play at all, right?
Can I add to that question and say, could they have a think about, the price of housing is so high in Newton already. So if it puts single family attached, we often get those in the land use committee, 4 units, 2 single family attached. And would they pass, if it was 25,000, would they just pass that on to the sales price and then further raise the cost of housing in Newton? So I'd like to think about that as well.
Well, I think the question is not one that, right now, the recommendation is not to change, just so we're clear. The question that had been asked by several members of the council is there some cash payment that ought to be considered for below 7 units, right? That's the question. And if so, what should it be? And the department is not prepared to give us an answer at this point. Councilor Farrell.
Just out of the loop, does this just mean full new construction, or what if people are taking a house and extending it from single family to 3 families, but maintaining the structure and expanding it? Are they part of this inclusionary zoning also? I mean, is that part of the consideration for inclusionary zoning? When we do this?
Well, if they were creating 4 units, it would be.
I mean, that's the whole
Is they're saying 4 to 6.
multifamily zones and stuff where we'd like people to take a house
I think
and expand it.
Right.
there's a question of what, do you have any kind of, first, what does it apply to? But let's assume you're talking about major renovation where you're adding additional units, right? Somehow you're changing the number of units on the site. So the question is, if you're changing the number of units on the site, is there a point at which the number becomes high enough that you should pay some cash, even though you're below 7, right? That's a question that's being asked, and we don't have an answer for that tonight. Councilor Kalis's perspective is we can't, it's an unknowable at this point. Let's go on, let's see how much we can get done. And maybe that's a reserved item for a later conversation. We have one reserved item as it is. The other question that Councilor Wright had raised, which I don't want to lose, is there some change that is warranted in the higher range? And if so, what is that range? And I'd like to get clarity on what the department and the consultant recommend on that part.
The 19.
Hmm?
7 to
Other side.
19.
Yeah, 7 to 19.
Yeah, 7 to 19.
So RKG and the department were recommending that we allow in lieu payments up to 19 units. Right now, we have the cutoff at 9. That's in part, as you said, from Ann Houston from the Housing Trust research about what we could do with that extra funding coming into the trust to develop new units and develop more affordable units than we're getting with the 80% units that are being, well, 80%, assuming they're homeownership, 80% units.
So the trade-off here is there's a recommendation to go to more payments rather than more units. I'm not saying that no units, but you're saying right now there's a requirement for in-kind above a certain threshold. So the recommendation is to modify that to allow cash instead, on the theory that the housing trust may be able to do more with that same amount of money than we would get from the developer on site. That's a policy choice that's an important one we need to clarify. I'm seeing, I think, Councilor Lee, Attorney Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I should have probably jumped in a little bit earlier once I realized that we're talking about, or there are some discussion amongst the councilors about a payment of cash when there's no inclusionary zoning requirement. I just wanted to stress that the law department has significant concerns of any requirement where there's a payment that isn't directly tied to an inclusionary zoning unit obligation. When we had originally opined on this cash in lieu of the inclusionary zoning unit, it was very clear that that was an option at the developer's discretion to do. Again, we have significant concerns of any payment that's below any threshold for the inclusion of a affordable unit.
Thank you for that. Because I think that's a very important issue. The idea is that you have to provide a unit and you can choose to provide cash instead, but you don't have a situation where legally we can just require you to provide cash and no unit, right? That's part of.
Correct.
Am I hearing that correctly? So that makes it very difficult if we keep the threshold at 7, to go below that and ask for cash, as I hear it as a legal matter. So while we might as a policy matter like to do that, we can't do it as a matter of law.
Well, if we change it down lower, then we could.
You could, sure. Yeah, you could.
And then we can do 2 to 6 units at a different rate than the bigger units because of the volume or whatever. So you still would get maybe 50,000 or 100,000 or something like that.
The point is that we've got to have at least one unit in order to play. It's out here, Attorney Lee, right?
I believe that what Councilor Wright is saying, okay, but instead of the threshold being at 7 units like it is today, move it to 2 or to 4, and then between, at that lower rate, it's not $650,000 per unit, it would be far lower.
Well, but I guess the question is, Mr. Lee, could the council make a decision to make a threshold lower and say that, from 4 to, or I'm just using this as a hypothetical, but 4 to 6 units, you don't have to provide a unit, but you have to provide cash. Is that an inclusionary option, or do we have to only ask for cash if we have a threshold where you have to provide a unit first?
It's the latter. You would have to provide the unit first, and then they have the option to do a cash payment in lieu if they'd like. With regards to Councilor Wright's specific question, I can't say, because there has to be, of course, that feasibility study to see is including a unit, not just the cash payment, but the unit itself, financially feasible for this project, so the inclusionary zoning ordinance is defensible. But then also, I do have concerns about having a different cash in lieu payment for smaller projects that's so drastically different. It would have to be grounded in some sort of rational calculation as to why it's so much less than the larger projects. Again, I haven't looked at that specific question, but I do, there's enough of a legal concern that the law department would want to take it under advisement.
Okay, thank you. So I think Councilor Kalis's point is even more relevant now, that we can't decide this, but I think there are certainly legal as well as policy issues in going below 7. So let us leave, if we're agreeable to say for purposes of moving this conversation along, let's leave it at that. We can ask the department to investigate with the law department, what is the feasibility of going below 7, but that involves financial as well as legal issues. But for tonight, let's stay, if we're agreeable with the current threshold. But the question that I think is still before us is, for the larger projects, do we have the discretion, and this goes to your point, Mr. Lee, if we go to the larger projects and say they have the option of providing cash as opposed to the units, is that a problem, or is that, as long as we just say that you have to provide the units or cash, we're okay? Just want to understand the legal context for that.
As long as we're leaving the discretion up to the developer on whether to include the units or the cash, it's fine.
Okay. Right, but what we're being asked to do is to allow cash as opposed to units up for larger projects, right? For the developer to have that option. Okay,
They have it now at 7 to 9 units.
they have from 7 to 9, but we're talking about raising the number to a higher number. Okay, want to comment on the rationale for that. You've said it a little bit before, that the housing partnership thinks, the housing trust analysis indicates that that would be beneficial in the total production of units. But is there any comment from members of the committee? I know Councilor Wright had concerns about that. Councilor Wright?
Yes, I have concerns. I'd rather keep the units, in the building and leave it as where we have it now, 7 to 9. I mean, I could see it go to 10, but I'd rather, they're gonna get some money anyways from the partial units, and then we're gonna discuss that later. But, having the 1 unit or 2 units in the building, I think is important to do.
So other members, does the department consulting?
And wait, can I just add one more thing? And most of those buildings are gonna be condos. They're not gonna be rentals. So I think it is important to have those condos in those smaller buildings to be affordable.
So does the department or the consulting wish to weigh in on this policy recommendation? Are you there? Yeah.
I'm sorry, are you talking to me? I'm having a hard time hearing.
Yes, we're just asking if you have anything to add. Councilor Wright has articulated a desire to maintain the requirement in the larger projects for a unit rather than go up to cash as recommended by the department and you. So the question is, where do we go? Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think so. 2 things. The first is that, and I'm going to split this between rental and owner again, because I think it's a different conversation. But for the rental side, is a building with just 1 unit or just 2 units is not just challenging from an administrative perspective on the developer, but it's also challenging on the administrative perspective for the city. It is costly, it is time costly to maintain and manage all of those things. If I owe you 1.5 units, financially, whether I pay you or I deliver that 1 unit is going to be immaterial. The bigger challenge comes is, how do I continually manage that, and how does the city continue to make sure that that unit's occupied by a household that's earning the income that they're supposed to be? And so that was part of the reason why we recommended moving away from 7 to 9 to 7 to 19. It just makes it easier. The second reason, as Director Heath has already said, is that it also creates more money that is then available to do more units in other projects, whether it be
participating in a LIHTC project where you're getting down to 30 and 50% of AMI units, or whether you're partnering with a developer on another project where they can deliver 4 units instead of 1 unit or 2 units, and you're providing a financial incentive. It just makes the management of it easier. So that's on the rental side. I'm actually, from now that we're kind of talking about splitting the difference between own and rental, leaving it at no cash payment option past 9 units for an owner project eliminates that bigger problem, which is monitoring, right? Because once you qualify the buyer, then that unit is going to be occupied by that entity until it's time to sell again. And so this may be one where you also look at a split strategy for owner and rental, where on the rental side, you say you can do a cash payment in lieu up to 19 units. And on the owner side, as long as you owe us a whole unit, you need to deliver it.
That's an interesting point. How does the committee feel about that? That seems attractive to me.
I agree with that one. First of all, most of them are going to be condos. Again, there's only maybe 1 or 2 buildings that are rentals at that size. And I think it should be monitored to make sure if things don't change, but I would be okay going up to 19 for rentals, cash in lieu of.
Just let me recognize you before you go.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What I'm hearing is you're okay with the provision. Rentals in lieu of for ownership, right? Is that fair?
It's actually a little hard to hear you sometimes. You need to speak a little louder. I couldn't hear that.
So our RKG has said that if we adjusted the ordinance to allow payment for rentals up to 19, but maintain it for ownership as a term, you would be okay with that.
I could, because it won't happen that often. If it was happening often, I wouldn't be, but it's not gonna happen very often. I'm okay with it.
It's not gonna happen very often.
Oh, it's not gonna happen very often. Okay. I think that's fair. Yeah,
Okay, Pam, you had something on.
there's some alternative music going in.
Okay, I'm at my mom's house, so I'll ask to have that TV turned down.
Oh, that's all right. We can always use an interlude here. Anyway, Councilor Getz, and then I'll go to Councilor.
Just doing a little bit of math in terms of understanding that in a 20-unit project, you have 3 inclusionary units, and then you incrementally go up. So I am just curious to know in terms of because it sounds like it is a burden, to administrate within planning. What, whether or not is it, what's the magic number? Is it 5? Does it turn into a different equation,
It's the same process, no matter how many units there are. So the developer who has an affordable unit has to do the same process that the developer with 20 units has to go through, and that's reviewed by the state, that's completing their plans, designating the units. So that's where it gets more burdensome. The fewer units we have, the more complicated it can be. It's also often a developer who may not be as experienced. And so they're learning as they go, and that can take some more time to explain how it works.
Yeah.
So 3 units is what we came out to. Once there's 3 units, yes, we want the units. It's worth it to go through that whole process. But less than that, we can do more.
Yeah, and then just even in sort of institutionalizing that sort of management, is that something that's, down the road in terms of using some of these dollars that come in so that it gets into a format that it actually becomes over time, it's controlled, especially, the ownership apparently is not an issue, but the rentals are gonna be problematic.
I think because the rentals have to be, every year we have to qualify.
Right.
So that's why it's more work for the rentals than for the resale. We will still be involved when there's a resale. It's just not going to come up as all.
Okay, so I want to recognize Councilor Danberg.
Thank you. I would be okay with that, with the cash payment. And I know that it's been said several times that it would be rare that a 8-unit, let's say, project would be rental, but there's an 8-unit project across the street from me that's being built that's a rental. So they do happen. But I'm okay with that.
Okay, so let's see where we are as a committee. I have general support for the idea of splitting this item in a sense for the rental to allow the cash payment up to 19, is it?
Correct.
But maintain the current requirement for the ownership, because we've maintained the second tier. Committee generally agreeable with that?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody dissent? All right, Councilor Kalis will join us online shortly. Okay, I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute bio break and come back and see if we can get, but I'm going to also suggest, Mr. Director, that we defer the parking item, because I don't like to get us finished with this item tonight. if that's-
Deputy Director Carroll will be thrilled with that.
And I apologize for reaching that decision this late, but I'd rather reach it now than later. Is that agreeable to the committee?
Yeah.
Okay, so you please let her know that she can, she's off duty.
Recording stopped.
Okay, folks, we're back from recess.
Recording in progress.
Back from recess, just to recap, we've I think disposed of that set of recommendations and provisional basis. Now let's go on to the next one.
All right, sharing screen again. This is Shaylin with the planning department. Can everybody hear me okay and see my screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the next recommendation by RKG is to adjust the current roundup, quote unquote, rule when calculating the number of inclusionary units required to a partial unit payment rule. So currently, if you owe the city 0.45%, or fractional, excuse me, of an affordable unit, you owe the city the next unit up. So currently speaking, if you owe 1.45 units, you owe 2 units actually. So RKG has recommended changing this roundup approach to the partial unit payment rule where any fractional unit, so 0.01 to 0.99, would be a cash payment to the city rather than rounding up. You only owe an additional unit once you hit that unit in the actual calculation itself. The partnership and the planning staff agree with this recommendation. And then just to illustrate what that looks like practically speaking, in a 50-unit project, rental project, I should say, you would owe 7.5 units at an average of 65% of AMI and 1.25 units at 110% of AMI. So again, practically speaking, you owe 9 inclusionary units and a cash payment of 0.25 or 0.25 times the current TDC, which is $650, which is $162,500. And as was mentioned earlier, the standard on how we split that has not been recommended to change at this time. So the city or the Affordable Housing Trust, I should say, would receive $81,250 of that cash payment, as would the Newton Housing Authority. So under RKG's recommendations, it looks slightly different. So it would be that 50 times the 17% or 8.5 units at an average of 65% of AMI. Again, practically speaking, that means we would have 8 total inclusionary units instead of 9, broken down into 4 units at 50, 4 units at 80, and a cash payment of $325,000, which is 0.5 times 650. Again, the Affordable Housing Trust and the Housing Authority would split that. And I'll pause there.
Just to be clear, this applies for both rental and ownership?
Yes.
Okay, because, and the question I have, is there any distinction in your mind now, because we've maintained the second tier, does the tiering make any difference here?
We're not gonna see it.
Under the recommendations right now, we were doing away with the tiering, and so there's a certain rationale here, but we maintain the second tier for ownership. Does that change the recommendation at all?
This is, I'm sorry. This is Kyle from RKG. No, it would not change my recommendation. This is intended, as someone has mentioned earlier, actually it's been mentioned a couple of times, this is an attempt to smooth out those curves so that we don't create disincentives to deliver that next unit. So this is one of the solutions that will help you by, instead of forcing the 0.45 to round up to the next unit, by going fractional, is you're going to smooth out those return curves. So you're going to remove disincentives to like jump to that next unit that will get you above 0.45.
Okay. All right. Any comments from committee? Councilor Wright, I believe.
Yep, thank you. So, the noise is the air conditioner, I think, because it's over 100 degrees out here, so to keep me from melting. So my question is, and this is maybe to planning, when the city builds affordable housing, do they ever build condos, units to sell, or is it always rental? Because my question is if it's always rental, then I think I would like to have some roundup of units when it's condos, and there's smaller numbers, so there's always that fraction, and maybe it's not 0.45, maybe it's 0.65 or something like that. So when the city, because you're gonna get that extra money. So when the city has that money, do they ever use that money for ownership units, or is it always rentals?
Okay, Ms. Kreitzer, can you answer that?
Yeah, so we have used city funds to fund all ownership projects. And we do remember.
It's hard to hear you. Can you speak a little louder? I'm sorry.
We have used city funds to fund both ownership and rental projects.
So what do you think is the percentage that's ownership versus rentals?
That I could get back to you on it. It's probably been a little bit of time since we've done ownership, but there was a point in time when we were doing quite a few of them. They tend to be, like you said, they tend to be smaller scale projects than some of the rental projects that we've done recently. But I can think of several, some off Lexington Road, a few in Upper Falls, that were all done. Crescent Street project, we just had a resale app for homeownership ones, this was in the early 2000s. So we do have a history of doing both. It just depends on where the market is.
Okay. Because my decision would be based on it, but it sounds like we haven't done any recently in the last 5, 8, 10 years.
I can't think of any, yeah,
Exactly.
I think that's true.
This is one, if I can, just, offer at least a perspective from my point of view, to have a unitary response. I would hate to have people in this situation start choosing between rental and ownership based on the roundup or not. It seems to me there's certain value in having the roundup, and a uniform system makes it easier to administer also. So this is one place that while there might be some marginal benefit for a roundup, as Councilor Wright has indicated, and the administrative side and also the incentive towards construction seems to me argue in favor of going to the recommendation from the council consultant, but that's just my instance.
The only thing I would add to that is over the 20 years that I've watched housing get developed, it's a very different model it's a different business model, the rental versus ownership. And I don't think they're gonna look at the inclusionary zoning aspects and make the decision, should I do rental or home ownership
yeah.
based on that? Because they're different. One is doing the rental because that's their ongoing business, and the other one's doing home ownership because that's their ongoing.
I think that's a useful point. Yeah, okay, fair point. But even if it is, a separate business model, does it make sense to have a distinction? That's what we're trying to wrestle with. I think the general idea from the recommendation from the consultant is that the roundup is not serving us as well as it would be a percentage. Kyle, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, so because of that, I would like to have the two differences, one for the condos, one for apartments, but 0.45 is pretty low. I'd like to see that number higher, 0.65, 0.7 or something, instead of a fractional, but to create that extra unit. And, Watertown Street, I think they were gonna add an extra unit, beyond what they needed. So it's feasible. I don't think we're not gonna get condos because of it, so I think it is feasible.
I'm sorry, you've answered a question I didn't ask. I was asking the consultant, but let's hold on a minute, if you don't mind. Kyle?
No, I really don't have anything to add there. I think that in this particular case, the adjusting the roundup to just a fractional payment will smooth out both ownership and rental. And so obviously the city does what the city wants, but our recommendation wouldn't change that. We would recommend that you eliminate the roundup and just make it fractional for both owner and rental.
Okay. And Mr. Heath, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, again, I think that an opportunity to have funds directed to the trust is a good thing overall because they can leverage more units in the long run. So this is just another example of how you might be able to do that.
Okay.
And the impact to units is minimal here.
Okay. So we have Councilor Wright who prefers to retain something for the home ownership as a roundup. If not the rental, how's the rest of the committee feel? Members of the committee? Vice Chair?
At this point, I'm comfortable going with, the planning department's recommendation.
Councilor Roberts?
Yeah.
Councilor Gibbs?
I'm okay.
Councilor Christman, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'm with the last three who spoke.
Okay, and Councilor Kalis, is he here yet?
Counselor Danvers.
Yeah, I know, but I just, Councilor Kalis specifically said he was joining, and I wanted to make
It
sure.
might be a little faint.
Oh, okay. Councilor Danvers?
We'll go with the recommendation of the planning department and, RKG.
Okay. Councilor Wright, I understand, but I think the sense of the committee is to go with a percentage. Let's see.
Okay, you guys are getting tired.
All right, so let's go with that, and let's go on to the next item.
Okay, so the next item, sorry, again, this is Shaylin from the planning department. The next item is or the recommendation to keep the total development cost, or TDC, cash in lieu payment standard at $650,000 and revisit that calculation again in 3 years. Currently, the Newton Affordable Housing Partnership needs to every 3 years take a look and adjust the TDC where necessary. This was last done in July of 2022, and the partnership voted to set the TDC at $650,000. So the recommendation by RKG is to leave it at $650,000 because we saw some standard payment options from RKG in the past where the construction cost was anywhere from $450,000 to $550,000 a unit, but we know that the cost to produce a new affordable unit is higher than $650,000. So that $650,000 kind of meets in the middle, and we can adjust that as needed in the future. Now, the partnership and the planning staff agree with this. However, we would like to see the language adjusted a bit. Currently, the ordinance reads that the TDC should be calculated no more than every 3 years. We'd like to adjust that to at least every 3 years, so we have the ability to respond to changing market conditions a little bit more flexibly. And I will pause there.
Okay, comments from the committee, Councilor Gibbs?
So, I'm just a little bit of clarification. What would be the trigger, in terms of at least every 3 years, then it leaves it open. So that then you would have to sort of have something that would, require or be to initiate it. There's gonna be something that's gonna, for whatever reasons, you're gonna either get a developer coming in saying, this number is totally erroneous, or a market condition, right?
So, but I think that's a reasonable question for changing the language. I just want to separate the item and just see the sentiment about $650,000. We're having recommendation to leave it at $650,000. Anybody on the committee dissent from that? Yeah.
So I don't want to dissent from that, but on the other hand, it costs more than $650,000 to build a unit. So I'm wondering, could you explain, Kyle, why you wanted to leave it there?
Okay.
Yes, I can. So the way that the math is calculated is based off of publicly subsidized units. And so the $650,000 reflects what it costs to build a publicly subsidized unit. That is not a reflection of what it costs to build a income controlled unit or an IZ unit in a private development. And so by setting the number to those publicly assisted units, it is creating a financial disincentive to provide cash, or to, if the developer chooses to do a cash option and the city is comfortable with it, to go that route. We're trying to get the policy to reflect the development that's going on. And so that's why our initial recommendation, to be very blunt, was to lower it. But we recognize the fact that at least at keeping it at $650,000, to Shaylin's point, is kind of splitting the difference, if you will. So trying to get it to be more reflective of the project that's being asked to provide a cash contribution.
Okay, let me just recognize a few other people who've got hands up. Counselor Danberg?
Sorry, I meant to lower my hand. I don't have a question.
Huntsman?
Were you calling on me, Mr. Chair? Sorry.
Hand was up, I thought.
It's hard to hear. Are you calling? Counselor Princeman, yeah?
Your hand is up, that's why I called on you.
Yes, that's the way it works. So that's why I raised my hand. I'm glad you called on me. Thank you. I guess I want to start by understanding that what we just heard, because it is counterintuitive to me. If the price we set for a cash payment in lieu of for a unit is lower than the cost to make, doesn't that, or if we lower the cost of the cash payment, doesn't that incentivize more cash payments rather than more building of units?
This is Kyle with RKG again. No, because the developers who are choosing between cash payments and building the units are based off of that financial metric that I talked about earlier, not the 650. And so right now the 650 is a disincentive for cash payments because they're not building publicly subsidized units. And so the point is, the recommendation to stay at 650 was trying to find a middle ground so that the number is more closely representative of the financial impact to a developer who is subject to IZ.
What do we think the actual, I'm really sorry, I'm still not understanding. What do we think the actual financial impact to a developer is, or the actual cost to a developer of building a unit?
So a non-publicly subsidized unit based on recent developments that have occurred in Newton is somewhere between $450,000 to $550,000 per unit in construction cost. The value differential from a market perspective is, and I'm quoting off the top of my head, Shailene, correct me if I'm wrong, is somewhere in like the 350 to 375 range. So a developer who is choosing between a cash payment and building the unit, the $650,000 is more of a financial hit than what it would cost them to actually build a unit for a developer who is subject to the IZ policy.
And
Okay.
just to jump, sorry to interrupt. I just want to anecdotally say that the Armory, an example of a publicly subsidized project here in Newton, I believe their per unit cost right now is somewhere in the 700s. So just to illustrate the difference between what it costs to create a publicly subsidized unit versus what Kyle just said, these market rate units that would be then subject to IZ are more in the ballpark of 450 to 550. A totally affordable, 100% affordable unit like the Armory is in the 700s. So this 650 kind of meets those in the middle.
Okay, I think I'm closer to getting it, and I appreciate that. I think philosophically, I want to set the basis for the payment in lieu of at more than it costs to actually build the unit. Because again, I think the incentive to be to actually construct the unit. And I would like there to be some point at which, there's a fraction of a unit owed based on the formula that actually incentivizes a developer to actually construct the extra unit. And it seems to me that setting the rate at slightly higher than what it actually costs to build a unit for the payment in lieu of purposes does that.
I think that's what I'm hearing the consultant has indicated he's done.
Yeah.
I agree. I didn't understand that at first. I think what I'm saying, is I agree with this now. So thank you.
Let me make sure I'm recognizing people. I'm going to recognize Councilor Lucas and Councilor Wright.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question on this 650. What was it before 650? Before we upped it in July 2022?
I believe it was set at 600 before.
Okay, 600. And we're still comfortable with the 650, even though the cost of everything in this world has gone up. It seems odd that we're keeping the cost of constructing one of these units the same at 650, no?
question, you've asked a question, the planning director can respond.
Yeah, I think, part of this is the market situation with respect to housing, period, the cost of materials and labor has skyrocketed. So, you could raise the cash in lieu number, but the end result might be that nobody builds housing in Newton, because the cost to comply with the IZ ordinance is so much that they can do it somewhere else a lot cheaper. So we're seeing, I saw an article maybe 2 weeks ago in Cambridge about a project that was approved and permitted and is not being built, because the developer can't make the numbers work. So, and I think Kyle alluded to that in his comments, you gotta be very careful where you set this, so you don't end up, disincentivizing the building of any house.
Okay, thank you. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Kyle from RKG say that if it will cost them more to do a cash payment in lieu of units than to provide the units? So this is to incentivize the units, no?
I believe that's what he said.
That is what he said. So if we were, for example, were to raise the 650, let's just say we raised it to 675. We increase it. A developer would be more inclined to build the units, which is what we want. At least that's what I want.
I don't have an answer, but maybe the department can, I mean, there's a judgment call here about a number, but.
Okay. Chair, I have one more question. And I was confused when Shaylin was talking about the 3 years. I was wondering if she could explain that again. It made it sound like right now we can update the ordinance under 3 years, but I think what you're saying is if you change it, it will be at least 3 years, no?
Can you hold on for a minute? I want to finish the number first. And we'll come back to the timing. Councilor Wright?
So I have a question, well, for RKJ, which they were gonna get back to me on the 650. And they're saying that for commercial or non-IZ units, it's 450 to 550 thousand for just construction costs. And how big are those units that you're talking about?
Kyle, do you have?
Yeah, so on average, they're about, this 450 to 550 units, on average, they're just under about 1,000 square feet.
Okay, 1,000 square feet. So, I mean, keeping it 650, you know, if a developer is at 5.8 units, it would be cheaper for them to build that 6th unit than paying cash in lieu of. But this is something that we should watch, and I'm glad that we're putting in that we will, you know, can review it more often than every 3 years. Thank you.
So let us presume that for purposes of conversation, 650 is where we are. Let's talk about the adjustment to the timing. Can we have clarification about the timing? What does it mean? Every 3 years? No. At a minimum.
At a minimum, that's correct. Every 3 years at a minimum with the ability to adjust it annually. If the market, conditions, warrant, thank you.
Okay. So the question that Councilor Getz asked earlier, which is the trigger, and you just responded to that. So does that answer your question? Okay. So are we agreeable with the recommendation on that, on the timing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Chair, I'm still confused on the 3 years. Can Ms. Davis explain that again, please?
Sorry.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm highlighting right here in the current ordinance conditions, it says no more than every 3 years, the average TDC per unit in Newton must be recalculated by the Newton Housing Partnership. What we would like to do and what the partnership agrees is to change that no more to at least every 3 years. So we have the flexibility to do an annual review if we so choose, to respond to the changing market conditions. As it's currently stated, this no more kind of restricts us to doing it once every 3 years. At least opens it up to doing it once a year, once every 2 years, a little bit more flexible.
Okay, well, the language, I'm sorry, the language is confusing. I don't know if there's a better way to write it where you could say we could update it every 1 to 3 years.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's all. So just my thoughts about that, but thank you.
Friendly suggestion. I do think the ordinance still requires the council to change the number though, right? So we can have a recommendation sooner than that, but we still have to vote the change.
So currently, no.
No?
Currently, it's the partnership that has that ability.
Oh, that's what I want to clarify.
The partnership sets the TDC every 3 years right now, but I believe you approve it though.
Correct.
Well, I guess the question is, what oversight do we have? Right now, there's a sort of a 3-year window to see how it works, and the department, they can't do it any sooner than that. If the partnership does it every year and changes the number in a way that, the council doesn't have any control over, that's done, we've delegated that authority. Is there any downside to that for us, or,
We haven't changed, we're not proposing to change that every 5 years. We did another look at the ordinance.
Yeah.
So I presume if we made this change and we find in 5 years that this has not worked out, we could change it again to be every 3 years or another number that works out.
Well, I guess the recommendation is to effectively give the housing partnership the ability to adjust this number on an annual basis, what it sounds like to me. And the question is that in the public interest to allow them to do that, waiting for another 3 years to go by? It seems to me there's value in having them being able to adjust to the housing market. So that doesn't bother me. It's the purpose is articulated is to set the number higher than it would be the cost to build the unit. If it turns out that building the unit becomes more expensive, then people will start paying the money rather than building the unit, and that's not where we want to be. So having some ability to adjust it does seem to make sense to me, and I'm not competent to make that judgment myself every year, but I'm perfectly glad to have people who are expert in this field make that judgment for us, which is what I hear you're asking us to do. Is that fair? Is the member of the committee okay with that? Councilor Krinsman, you had a question?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything you said. I think the council's oversight remains because we can always change the ordinance if we want, or we can always intervene if necessary. I actually don't know why we wouldn't just automatically review the number every year. I don't mean we, the council, I mean as a city, especially if it becomes sort of a formula with that folks can calculate pretty easily in terms of looking at what costs have gone where. Why wouldn't we just do the calculation every year?
I don't see any barrier to it, but I think that if we put in the ordinance to say at least annually, right? Is that too soon, or a biannual? The part of the problem is we have volunteers in effect in the housing partnership. We're asking them to make a relatively
and that's sort of my question. Is it an administratively overly cumbersome task to recalculate this number? It doesn't seem like it is. If it is, that's fine. Let me know. And to your point, Mr. Chair, if you're worried about council oversight or this going too far, we could always say that it's an annual calculation unless the city council objects within 90 days or something.
Well, we can do that. I'm not sure we need to, but the vice chair had a point.
I agree.
Isn't there a cost associated with doing the homework required to adjust the number? Isn't there a consultant involved every year or every time we do it?
I believe we did it in-house for us.
So yes, just you do your own homework and look at the marketplace, what's going on in costs and then yeah, there is no barrier. You could do it every year or when you feel the need, which I assume could be up to annual.
Could it be as needed, but no less than every 3 years?
Well, I think if you say at least annually.
But maybe you need it more than, maybe something happens and you need it in 6 months. Why stop that?
I'm not wedded to that. I'm just trying to figure out what the language. I think let's not try and solve the language problem, but I think the policy behind the language is to give the flexibility to the housing partner to make adjustments as may be appropriate in order to accomplish the objectives of the ordinance.
At least every
You know,
3 years.
if they do it every 3 years, that's fine. If they do it every year or every 6 months, you know, it's just a matter of, yeah. And we have some, I assume if it becomes counterproductive, we'll hear about it and then the council can respond. Is that agreeable?
Yes.
Okay. All right. All right, Councilor Wright, your hand is up now. I want to move on, but I don't want to leave it.
Yeah, it's in that section. I just have a quick question for RKG. So this was in their chart back, I don't know, last time they were here. And so 650 is our number, and construction costs they had was 400K. Today they're saying 450 to 500, 550K per unit. What's the value gap? What's that definition? And that was at 380.
So value gap is what the residual value of the unit is as a market rate unit compared to what it is as an income controlled unit. And so there's a difference between how much it costs to build the unit and how much the unit is worth after it's built based on having it a preset rent as opposed to being able to rent it against the market. And so that value gap calculation is, let's say I owe you a unit and you say, I'm going to let you make that a market rate unit, not an affordable unit. Well, that creates a value of $380,000 for me. It may have cost me $500,000 to build it, but the affordable unit still has a value, even at a lower rent. It's obviously much lower than a market rate unit is, but it still has a value. And so the value gap is the calculation that we usually try and peg a partial unit payment calculation to, because you're not giving the developer the value of construction. They're going to build the unit. You're only giving them a value of being able to charge market rate as opposed to the income controlled. And so that's what that is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Councilor Princeman, I'm sorry.
Yep, thank you. Final point on the frequency with which the number is updated. Again, I think annually is sufficient. I know we'd all like it updated as regularly as possible or whatever, maybe because of tariffs or what have you. But I think builders should reasonably expect some certainty and some continuity of policies and not changing conditions. So I think if it were just a regular annual review, I think that would suffice. Thank you.
I'm comfortable with that. The committee comfortable with that? Okay, so we'll go with an annual, at least annual review, all right? Okay, next item.
Okay, Shaylin again from the planning department. The next item is to provide a concrete definition of what an unusual net benefit constitutes. Now, unusual net benefit is mentioned twice in the ordinance. For offsite and for a cash payment option. For the cash payment option, if the developer can prove a quote unquote unusual net benefit, they could buy out of their inclusionary zoning unit requirement. And for the offsite to be considered by the city council, there needs to be an unusual net benefit to putting the inclusionary units somewhere else that is not within the actual building being proposed. So RKG's recommendation is providing a concrete definition, giving some criteria to potentially define that. They have presented us with 3 options here: a higher set aside percentage, or an example of that is if you provide 25% of your units as affordable units as opposed to the requirement, which is about 15%, give or take, depending on the amount of units. Lower the AMI threshold, so an average of 50% rather than 65%, or a larger cash contribution or 10% higher than what the cash payment would be required. The partnership has agreed with this recommendation to provide a more concrete definition, or at least give some criteria as to what an unusual net benefit constitutes, but ask the planning staff to give some more examples of what that could be. So we provided, can you provide more deeply affordable units at a different site? Can you increase the total amount of units at a different site? Is the alternative site within a mile or so of a T station, really close to transit or amenities? And then again, that higher cash in lieu payment. So the planning department is really adding in the proximity to transit and the proximity to amenities. And I will pause there.
Okay, so let me just say, historically, I think this has been a challenge for members of the council for us to find a net benefit that's unusual enough to allow the units to go off site. Remember, there were conversations recently about the project that was in Ward 8, whether it could send some of its units to Ward 7, and we decided that was not a good idea for a variety of reasons. And so there is a sort of a important policy here that I think there's been a historical preference in the council for maintaining the units in the original location rather than having them somewhere else. So having some more specificity has some value. The question is, does this involve sufficient incentive to take the units off-site so that we lose the benefit of having the units at the site where they originally started? And that's part of the question I think we're wrestling with. Director
Yeah,
Lee?
so that's certainly addresses the off-site piece. And then the other piece is, can you provide an in lieu payment rather than providing the units? Both of these are special permit decisions that the council would have to make. And I think the suggestion here is, let's provide a little more guidance to the council in terms of what to look at in their decision to decide whether there's an unusual net benefit, because it's kind of wide open with the language right now.
Right.
And I think we'd look to tighten that a little bit and have some criteria.
So I think that's helpful. In other words, this would be such as, but not necessarily dispositive. In other words, a developer could come in and say, I'm willing to do this, this, and this. And the council could still say, as part of the special permit process, not enough, or not good enough here. So we're not doing away with the definition. We're just saying these are examples of what could qualify. Is that a fair summary?
That is.
Okay. Comments from the committee? Councilor Wright.
Maybe this is a question for the law department, but if you put these numbers in there and it is going to go to a special permit, but let's say you say 25% of the units affordable, and they do it, and you still didn't give them a permit, can't they come back and sue you because this is what you're saying, that's the bar? Can they?
Do you still willing?
So could planning clarify, are they saying that they're gonna put in this criteria as guidelines or as kind of objective standards that, again, as Council Wright noted, if they meet it, then they are granted the relief?
As I understood it from the director, these are guidelines of ways that could be met, but not there. You can meet any one of these and still have the committee find there's not sufficient net benefit. Is that fair summary?
Yeah, I think. Oh, Kyle disagrees with that.
I think my understanding was that these were kind of, if they're met, then that would be considered satisfying the requirement. To Council Wright's point, I think there is a concern that if you put these kind of static conditions and then say that they're met, that they're still not meeting that unusual net benefit. So with this different understanding, I think that the law department would like to take a closer look to advise on if there's a way to do this that would not limit the land use committees or the city council's ability to deny a special permit, and to have this more as guidelines as opposed to kind of criteria that have to be adhered to.
And my next option on there, and I agree with Attorney Lee on this, but the other one is the 10% more in cash payment. That's way too low. I'd like to see it like 50% or whatever, because they're gonna try for that.
Councilor Wright, just bear with me a minute. Just let me recognize you first, because Well, I'm in the process of trying to recognize you. I can't understand what you're saying. So if you just pause for a moment before you start. Now, would you like to say something in addition to what we just said about maintaining it as discretionary?
Yes, I agree with Attorney Lee that I want to make sure that if they need it, it doesn't, they can't, that's not just the only thing they need. We still need to vote for it. But in the criteria that you listed, you're saying a larger cash contribution of 10% more? That's way too low. I think it should be like 50% or whatever, because I could see that's the option they would go for. And that's not what we want. We want the units there in the building.
Yeah, I think maybe this is a case where in the process of drafting, there's some support from the committee. There's some background noise. I don't know where it is, but there's support in the committee for having guidelines. And then, but the thrust of the guidelines should be that we don't want to make it an easy choice for somebody to go offsite, especially the offsite piece, as opposed to the providing cash, as opposed to, they're two different questions. So I think in the process of doing the, but I think that the general idea of being more specific has support in the committee as guidelines. Is that fair? If so, let's go on to the next item with the understanding that the law department and the planning department. Oh, Kyle, you have something you want to add? Yeah.
Yes, I do. Thank you. So the intent of this recommendation was to codify a standard by which if they met it, then it meets the unusual net benefit. So I support the concept that if these are too low, then set it at whatever you want. And that's fine. But the intent here was to take away the uncertainty of it so that it was a known factor to a developer who may want to do a payment in lieu or who may want to do offsite, so that it becomes very, very clear. And so the point that was made earlier could be another requirement, which is it has to be within the same ward of which the original development was being made. That could be a requirement of it too. If you are only going to do it as a guideline, like for example, this is what it would be, I just assume you not put anything in there, because that's going to ultimately become more confusing to a developer than if you put in something that if you meet this, then you will get granted that privilege. So we're trying to get rid of some of the uncertainty and unpredictability. And I would argue if you just put it as a guideline saying, for example, this is what it would be, I think that would actually add to the uncertainty and the unpredictability. And so I would say just leave it as is. But I would encourage you all, and the point of this recommendation, at least from RKG, was to codify. If it's a 50% increase in cash payment, then great. And we just put examples of what it would be for you to have something to gnaw on. But I would say if you're not going to make it, if you hit this, then you get it, then I wouldn't do it at all. That's just what I wanted to add. And I need to go dark for about 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'll be right back as soon as I can.
We've been joined online by Councilor Kalis, I noticed. All right. I want to hear, in light of that comment, I hear from Councilor Maliki. Sorry.
Thank you. I would be inclined not to change this language at all. None of these, I mean, to me, an unusual net benefit, I'd kind of want to be blown away and really impressed, and none of these standards hit that level for me. And particularly, as Councilor Wright pointed out, the larger cash contribution of 10% more, which, so we're talking 10% more of 650,000, that's $65,000. That's pathetic. So I think considering what Mr. Lee said and Mr. Talente said, I think we're better off just leaving this alone and not changing it. Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to indicate that I'm sort of persuaded by that argument to leave it the way it is. But I want to see where committee members are.
But if we leave it the way it is, nobody will still understand what unusual net benefit means.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we get rid of it. If we don't ever intend to use it, just get rid of it. I mean, we're never gonna use it. What good is it being there?
Good point.
Well,
Mr. V.
I could imagine a case where you might want to consider something like that, where the development is such that providing affordable units doesn't make any sense because of where it's located potentially. And there's no access, as we talk about, to transit. And it's not walkable, it's not near any amenities. As opposed to those dollars that could be provided to create affordable housing units located close to transit and amenities. So I think it's probably unusual that this would happen, but I see some value in keeping that option for the city council to consider.
I think so, then we have to define it, we should define it. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
we don't have the
Don't
right.
forget,
I'm just curious, has this ever been used within the city that you know of? Meaning, has there, this specific example where they've actually, developed a site and then they built the units out?
Council Baker shared one example where it was tried to be used, where they actually had another site, which that in itself is incredibly rare. But in that case, it didn't work.
But it's never been applied. This is never,
I don't think it has.
But imagine for example, I don't say this would be the case, imagine somebody was gonna pay you twice what the cash value was for. I mean, that might be an offer that you might wanna consider.
Okay, so that's.
I mean, this is a tricky one because historically, we worked very hard to keep the units where they began. And I guess I'm coming back to the perspective that even though I'm sympathetic to normally defining a term like this, that because I'd like to maintain the opportunity, but to have somebody come in as Director Heath, I don't know if promoted you or demoted you, but never mind. Director Heath has indicated that some language would be helpful. It seems to me that this is one of those places where I would leave the language alone, but have the report of this conversation maintained, because I think the land use committee would benefit from having these ideas. But I'm not yet ready to go codify what this means. And while I understand RKG's recommendation, I'm not sure I'm there yet myself, but I want to see where committee members are.
Can I just ask the plan, you asked RKG to define it. You asked for that, so I'm wondering why you asked for it.
So there was a project, it didn't end up going anywhere, but there was a project that after it was permitted, came back and asked could they.
That's the
could they
same one
get-
that the Ward 8, Ward 7.
No, this is a different one, I believe, that they were looking for, what if they gave us more money? What was the magic number?
I see.
And land use asked partnership to assist them in defining what is an unusual net benefit. And that kind of raised this question of, should it be more clear what is an unusual net benefit? Because I think everyone struggled with trying to figure out what is enough to make it worthwhile to not have those units. And I think some members of the partnership came up with a number. The developer in the end decided it was not one they wanted to work with and they dropped it. But that's kind of what raised the question.
How many times the 650 was it? Was it like twice as much?
No, it was.
It was more than twice.
It was $300,000 more than the 650. This was the Civico project.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
On Grove
I
Street.
want to say it was 1.8 or was it 2 million?
Maybe total, but per
unit,
it was around 300,000.
Yeah. So it was a definite increase, but not double.
So you can set it high enough so that nobody ever wants to use it.
Well, that apparently what happened here. But,
Yeah.
I think at the moment, given what we got to accomplish, I would leave this language alone and carry on to the next item if that's agreeable to me. But record this.
I'm just more concerned in the loop of the codifying and then going to, then it means that you
Yeah.
get your permit. It takes away that control from the chance.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a good
All right,
idea.
so I think the sense.
Chairman Baker, do you see my hand up? It's
Sure.
Vicky.
I'm sorry,
Councilor Danforth?
Councilor Danberg.
Yes, thank you. Just a comment on this. I think we don't want to beat this to death tonight, certainly not at this hour, but My thought is that we should keep it, but define it. I can see certain circumstances where it would work. If, for example, you had a 3-bedroom unit in a building where there are largely older people. The child, if it's not near an elementary school or it's not near amenities, if there are children and the children have nobody else to play with, they would do better off-site in a place that would be more friendly toward their lifestyle. So I would keep it, but I do think we need to define it because a developer needs to know exactly what this means. If we didn't know, they're not gonna know.
So, again, those are examples that I would think would be offered at the time of the special permit, because that's not a definition it's in the list. Part of the difficulty of making the list is that my guess is we'll move towards a monetary contribution, rather than these sort of intangibles. And I think setting the number is going to be a difficult thing to do itself. So, that's part of the reason that I'm not prepared personally to vote for the specificity, but I want to just get a sense of the committee. I hear Councilor Danberg in favor of it. Councilor Vice Chair.
I'm inclined to leave it alone for now.
Okay.
I don't think we've helped ourselves with this conversation at all.
All right.
In any direction.
All right. Councilor Albright.
Is it worth saying is something like with the advice of the housing partnership so that it just makes it, just pushes it off to them?
No, I can't.
Okay, never mind.
Okay, Councilor Cass.
Well, I appreciate the, wanting to have it a working definition, but then I'm also stuck with the legal aspect of this.
So we leave it alone.
Yeah.
All right, you leave it. I just want to get a sense of committee. Councilor Danberg would like to see it codified. Councilor Kalis,
Leave it alone.
Councilor Wright.
You're muted.
You're muted.
I know, sorry. Leave it alone.
Okay, Councilor Princeman.
I'm leaving it alone. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we leave it alone and go on. Okay, next item. It's almost 10 o'clock, folks. I want to get through this. Can the committee bear with me to try and get us through? And I'd like to
How many more do we have?
include this item if we can.
4 pages.
4 pages. I think these will be quicker. So, okay,
All right, so Shaylin from the planning department again. The next one is to remove the second requirement under the public funding limitation provision. Now, this provision is essentially to stop quote unquote double dipping. So the city can't pay you or give you or grant you money for your project to provide the inclusionary units. That's essentially what this is saying here. It's also saying that there's no public funding allowed really to provide the inclusionary units, except in the following cases. So the first one, those that represent a greater number of affordable units than otherwise would be required by this subsection and not receiving additional market rate units according to section whatever. RKG's recommendation is to remove this second one. So those that are lower than the maximum eligible income limit for some or all inclusionary units by at least 10 percentage points. And then the third criteria to meet is those that exceed regulatory requirements in providing for persons with disabilities. So really, it's just to remove the second requirement in order to open up some more flexibility for tax credit projects. So currently our ordinance 10 percentage points lower would be an average of 55% of AMI. And for tax credit projects, they tend to range between 50 and 60% of AMI. Which this provision could hurt that portion. So it's just to remove the second item here. Planning staff agrees with RKG's recommendation, and then the partnership has asked the planning staff to clarify and revise just the general confusing nature of this language, of this provision of the ordinance, to see if we can make it a bit clearer and more straightforward in general. I'll pause here and then Kyle might be able to provide some more context here. He explains this provision much better than I do.
Kyle?
You had a 5-minute.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm back. Can you hear me? This is Kyle from RKG. So yeah, so our take on this section is that it limits the city's ability to participate in projects to get either more affordability in terms of a higher set aside, or getting lower AMI by partnering with a developer. Because the way it's worded right now, if I owe you 15% of my units and 65% of AMI, and you say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you some money if you go down from 65 to 50. So we'll cover the impact, but we want you to provide lower income households access. By definition of this policy, those units no longer qualify for IZ. And so from our perspective is we want this to be cleaned up so that projects that offer greater than what they're required by the IZ policy can take advantage of some sort of partnership with the city in that example. And this applies to like LIHTC projects that don't provide a full 100% affordability, but they receive public subsidy. And in fact, technically, LIHTC projects don't meet this policy because all those units are publicly subsidized. So we're just trying to get the language cleaned up for you. That's all.
Okay, committee members, any comment on this? Yeah, Councilor Danberg.
Sorry, I should have taken my hand down, sorry.
Right, anybody dissent from this? It seems like fairly straightforward. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay, so the next provision is, or the next recommendation, excuse me, is to remove the supportive services agreement requirement from the extremely low income provision option of the inclusionary zoning ordinance. Now, this provision of the ordinance, to my knowledge, has never been used. And it essentially allows you to provide an extremely low income tier at 30% of AMI, in addition to that tier 1 average at 65% of AMI, or the affordable tier, excuse me, at 65% of AMI. And then there is a requirement currently for tier 2 under this provision as well. However, under RKG's recommendations, that would eliminate the tier 2 option under this piece of the ordinance as well. What RKG has found in discussions with developers is that this supportive services provider partnership requirement really kills the ability and the option to use this provision because it becomes prohibitively expensive to provide the extremely low income units at 30% of AMI and to have a contract in place with a supportive services provider in order to provide any resident services needed by the very few units that would be created at 30% of AMI. So that's RKG's recommendation. RKG also, in addition to removing the supportive services agreement, has recommended we actually advertise this option under the ordinance because it's never been used to my knowledge, and it's not widely known about in the development community. Planning staff, we tend to agree with RKG's recommendation. The partnership did not, unfortunately, get to this at their previous meeting. However, they have been extremely concerned about resident services in the past and would like to continue their discussions on this piece at their meeting tomorrow evening, actually. They have discussed in the past that resident services is maybe not the inclusionary zoning ordinance is not the best place for a resident services provision. But they don't know exactly where the best place for a resident services provision is. To back up one more step, RKG recommends us actually leveraging what the city already has in the Health and Human Services Department, who provide many of the services and critical services that folks who would be living in an ELI unit would potentially need to access. And I will pause there.
So let me just pause. So basically this is a provision that has not been used, is not advertised at the moment, and because we don't know what it means, and we may have alternatives, there's a recommendation we delete it. Mike, I heard something? Yeah, Counselor Holmberg.
So I think, based on what I've learned from the folks at the Housing Partnership, that these supportive services are very important. And they find ways to provide them by partnerships with people with, I don't know how they do it, but they figure it out. But I don't think our Health and Human Services Department could be a provider of these services. They don't have the kind of staff that it would take. So I agree that it probably should be somewhere, but maybe not here in the inclusionary zoning ordinance.
So let's, if the committee is agreeable, let's follow the recommendation of the consultant on this one, but understand that this is a conversation that may be continued at the public hearing. Because we would like to have some sense, to follow up on Councilor Albright's point, there is a place, and I think the Housing Partnership is reaching the same objective. There ought to be some way of assuring these services are provided. And right now, it doesn't seem like this ordinance is doing it, but we need to do it. And the question is, how should it be done? But I'm not sure that the ordinance is the place it belongs, as I'm hearing it. Is that a fair summary for the committee?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go move on to the next one. Let's see where we are.
Wait. I have my hand up. This is Pam. So, I mean, the reason why we have it there, it was each building was providing this services or requiring to provide services. So taking away is taking away those services?
Well, it's the last time we had a conversation with the consultant about this. Turns out that the administrative burden of trying to pull these services together for a small project is quite significant. And basically, it's a disincentive for people to come in with a small project. A big project, maybe you could pull it off because you've got the resources on site, in effect, in terms of building management and other relationships you could build and to do it. But as I recall, and maybe Kyle can elaborate on this, that the size of the project was really having this requirement was making it.
Yeah, I understand that part, but I think it should be addressed more. These are the services we think should be required for units over 100 that's in-house, and under 100, how, the city can provide those services or something. But this is I just feel like it's just kind of punting it in the air and there's nothing behind it.
Planning Director.
Yeah, I think on this one, we're simply trying to breathe some life into this to potentially get some of those extremely low income units. So we're removing a requirement and frankly a cost for this piece in the hopes of actually seeing some of these units materialize.
So the trade-off is that by having this requirement, we're not getting the low income units.
Correct.
And if we take it away, maybe we will get some. We won't provide the services, so there's
Okay, I'm fine.
and maybe,
Yeah.
but I guess let's go with the advertising of removing it, but have a conversation. You all take some homework on that, if you would. Councilor Wright has argued for sort of a graduated approach, and maybe there's something there, but I think this one's probably going to need a little more, and we'll hear from the Housing Partnership on this anyway. So, but I'd like to move us along and see where we are. Okay, next one.
Okay, so the next one, sorry, Shaylin again with the planning department. The next recommendation is to replace the cash payment in lieu calculation under elder housing with services with the standards that are set forth earlier, or I should say the recommended standards set forth earlier in this presentation by RKG. So currently the alternative compliance or cash payment in lieu compliance option for the elder housing with services option under the inclusionary zoning ordinance is a little confusing. You can see we use a cost of care survey that's annually done by the Genworth group, I believe they're called, to get an hourly sense of what an in-home health provider would be. Then we multiply that by 3 hours per day, 365 days per year over a 10-year period. And then we multiply that by the amount of beds required. So I've kind of broken it down here at the bottom. The current inclusionary zoning requirements for 150 beds would be 0.5 or 5%. So there would be 7.5 beds required. So option A that a developer has currently is to provide 8 beds on site, all restricted at 80% of AMI. And then the option B, that payment in lieu, would be a payment of $8,160,000. And I've broken it down here just so you can kind of see the calculation itself. So this 650 is the TDC. You add that to, again, $40 per hour. This is based on the 2024 estimates by the Genworth and Care Scout group. 3 hours per day. So it's assuming that anybody in an assisted living or some sort of elder housing needs 3 hours per day of services for 365 days a year over a 10-year period, multiplying that by that 7.5 beds required to get, again, this $8.1 million and change. This is really complicated for developers to understand, and although staff can provide this to them, it's complicated to understand, and it's prohibitively expensive, we think, to choose this option in the end. It's still pretty expensive, candidly, to choose the other option, which would just be to match the cash payment standards recommended above, which, again, for 150 beds at an elder housing project, it would be a 0 or a 5% requirement. So multiply the 150 times 0.05 to get 7.5 beds required. You would then either have option A, provide 7 beds on site, restricted at 80% of AMI, and a cash payment of $325,000. Again, that 0.5 that of the 7.5 still results in a cash payment. Or if you want to provide a payment in lieu instead, it's $4.875 million as opposed to the $8.1 million by just multiplying the 7.5 beds required by the current TDC. So it's still, I mean, pretty expensive to buy out of this option, but it is a little bit more straightforward than the calculation we currently have set out. And I will pause. Oh, I won't pause there. I will say planning staff agree with this recommendation, and the partnership has not yet come to a consensus on it. They're going to talk about this more, not tomorrow night, but I believe at their July meeting.
So,
and now I'll pause.
okay. Councilor Albright.
This one, we had this project on Washington Street in Ward 1, where they were gonna pay a lot of money for in lieu. Did they pay a lot of money? I think it's Sunrise? Yeah, we have units. We have units.
Or
But
beds.
the problem is the people in those beds need services. And they don't have the money to pay for the services, so it's a very complicated problem that we've required this, and we don't require that they pay the services for these people. So we've gotten over our heads, I think, in this particular requirement without thinking it through.
That's Director Heath.
I agree with that completely. And many communities don't even touch elderly housing and don't apply the IZ ordinance for that reason.
So, we have the department's recommendation. We don't have yet a recommendation from the Housing Partnership, but I'm disposed to go with the department's recommendation as an interim. I grant to Councilor Albright's point is a larger one, I think, than just this response. But for purposes of advertisement, I would prefer to get something ready and done for the next meeting. The committee comfortable with going with their department's recommendation for this, at least provisionally?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Councilor Frenchman? Anybody dissent?
I don't
Okay.
necessarily dissent, but I would like for somebody to speak to the project over in Washington Street and see how that's going. And, you know, what their problems are, so we have some real life experience to the committee.
Yeah, that would be useful for the time that you go to the public hearing. All right, I think that's the last of our, right? We got anything else?
That's all from me. Just next steps, again, would be a recommendation to have a public hearing in September.
Right, but.
Happy to make a motion for a public hearing in September.
We may have to go to October, we just have to figure out our timing, but I would be glad to set a public hearing. And we should know the timing of it by the next council meeting. If the committee is agreeable for the fall, I will try and work with the department and the law department to figure out a timing on this. But just for purposes of substance, are the committee comfortable on a provisional basis going with what we've talked through tonight? If so, I would entertain a motion to hold, but with the understanding we would go to a public hearing in the fall, either late September or early October. Somebody's hand up? With following the recommendations we've gone through. Is that are we comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, happy to move hold with that understanding.
Okay. Councilor Krinsman has moved hold. Any comment from any member of the committee?
One comment. Contrary to what Councilor Wright says about us, I am excited to get started on parking right now.
We had decided earlier that we were going to. I know. We still have one other item, however, which is a brief item, which is a reappointment. And
sorry, Mr. Chair, I interrupted you taking a vote on the motion to hold.
So I need to take a vote on the motion to hold. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. Okay, that's 4424. I'm going to indicate that 4524, the inclusionary zoning and training, I move hold on that because we really take that up at the time. So, Councilor, move hold on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to move hold on the next two items.
Okay, and the parking as well is 18124. Councilor Krinsman's moved hold on both those items. All in favor say aye. Abstain? Ayes have it. Okay. And the last item is reappointment of Harvey Shore to the Newton Historical Commission as a reappointment. This is item 18125. His appointment is set to expire June 21st, 2028. He's Bellevue Street. That's Ward.
I believe it's Ward 1.
Ward 1.
So I will entertain a motion from the vice chair.
I want to say one thing. This is Councilor Wright.
Oh, we have a hand. I'm sorry. Yes, Councilor Wright.
I'd like to say Harvey is probably one of the best people that we have right now on the Newton Historic Commission, and he's very thoughtful. He has a great eye. He has the background in it, and I think Councilor Getson would agree with me. So I'm very happy that he's staying on.
We have a motion to approve by the vice chair.
Yes, you do.
Okay, all those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. I think that concludes our business. And I think members of the committee and those attending, and certainly we appreciate RKG being here to do that, as well as Shaylin from your end, and Mr. Lee, as always, we're glad to have you. And I think that's it for tonight. And folks, we are not having a meeting in August. You know, I promised you all you would have, and also our staff needs a break here. But we're going to be back at it very vigorously in September. We will have a report at the beginning in early September on the facade question. The department's working on that. We won't have an answer for you. And so we're probably going to have a public hearing on that one, assuming we get to some level of comfort to go to public hearing early in October. So I just want to give you all a sense of where things are. Is there anything else I should mention?
There is a meeting on July 9th, however.
Yeah, July 9th, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks. Okay, anything I've forgotten? I want to thank you all for your patience, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.